To understand what happens in the story we're telling tonight, you need to understand where these people were. Not just geographically, though that matters, but existentially. You need to understand the interior landscape of a people who had been wandering for a very long time. The children of Israel had been in the wilderness for years, not weeks, not months, years. The exact timeline is complex. There are passages in the biblical text that suggest the wilderness period spanned roughly 40 years in total. But what matters for tonight is not the precise number. What matters is the quality of those years, the texture of that time. They had come out of Egypt with extraordinary momentum. The plagues, the Passover, the parting of the Red Sea. These were not quiet events. They were the kind of events that reshape the identity of a people, that become the defining story passed down through every subsequent generation. We were slaves, God heard our crying, and God brought us out. That was the story. That was the beginning of who they were. But the beginning had been a long time ago now, and the middle, the wilderness, the wandering, the years of tent and manna and dust, had been going on long enough to start to feel permanent, long enough for the extraordinary to begin to feel ordinary, long enough for gratitude to start to curdle, slowly and almost imperceptibly, into something else. The Sinai Desert is not like any landscape most of us will ever encounter in our ordinary lives. It is a place of tremendous, overwhelming scale. The sky above it is enormous, not the partial sky you see between buildings or through car windows, but the full sky, the entire vault of it, pressing down on a landscape that has almost nothing to interrupt it. The rock formations are ancient beyond comprehension, worn by millions of years of wind into shapes that do not look like anything a human hand could have made. The heat during the day is the kind of heat that makes the air itself seem to shimmer and warp, as though reality is not quite solid at the edges. And the nights in the Sinai wilderness are something extraordinary. When the sun drops below the horizon, the temperature falls dramatically. The desert does not hold warmth the way other landscapes do. The rock releases the heat it has stored all day, and then the cold comes, clean and absolute. And the sky above fills with stars in a way that simply cannot be imagined by someone who has only seen the night sky from inside a city. There are no competing lights. There is nothing to dilute the ancient dark. The stars are not points of light in the distance. They are presences. They fill the whole dome of the sky from one horizon to the other, and they are so numerous and so bright that on a clear night in the wilderness you can see by them. This is the world the people of Israel had been living in. This was their home, such as it was. Tents and sand and rock and sky, the manna on the ground each morning, the water from sources that kept appearing in impossible places, the long, slow procession through terrain that looked mostly the same from one week to the next. And now, in the specific moment the Book of Numbers describes, they had hit a wall. They had been travelling south. They had been trying to pass through the land of Edom, the territory that lay between them and the next stage of their journey north toward Canaan. The king of Edom had refused them passage. He had sent soldiers to the border to enforce that refusal. And so Israel had been forced to turn away, to circle around, to take the long road south toward the Red Sea before coming back north again. This was a setback, not a catastrophic one in the grand scale of what they had survived, but a soul-wearying one, because it was not a new experience. It was one more in a long series of moments when the promised land had seemed close and had then receded again. One more episode of almost and not yet. One more stretch of road that pointed in the wrong direction. The text says simply that the people grew impatient on the way. In the original Hebrew, the word used carries a sense of the soul becoming shortened, constrained, squeezed. It is a vivid image. The soul that has been enduring and enduring suddenly reaching the end of its capacity to endure. Not a sudden explosion, but a gradual compression that finally reaches its limit. And from that compression, words began to come. Words that had been held back for too long, that had been polite for too long, that had been managed and suppressed and kept on the right side of acceptable. Now, finally, they came out. Part 2, the sound of complaint. The complaint of the people of Israel in Numbers 21 is not the first time they have complained in the wilderness. If you have read any of the preceding chapters of the Torah, you know that the wilderness narrative is punctuated repeatedly by episodes of murmuring, grievance, and open rebellion. The people complained about water at Mara. They complained about food and longed for Egypt in the desert of Sin. They complained again at Rephidim. They built a golden calf at Sinai. They complained about their hardships at Taberah. They wept about the lack of meat and expressed nostalgia for the food of Egypt at Kibroth Hattaavah. They sent spies into Canaan and then despaired at the report and talked about choosing a new leader to take them back to Egypt. The wilderness narrative is not a story about a people who trusted perfectly and marched forward with steady faith. It is a story about a people who struggled enormously with the gap between what they had been promised and what they were currently experiencing, and in that struggle they frequently failed, which is to say, they were human. They were very recognisably, uncomfortably human. The complaint in Numbers 21 has a particular character to it, though. It is not just a complaint about circumstances, it is a complaint about the entire arrangement. The people spoke against God and against Moses. They asked, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread and there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." That last phrase is the one that stings. We detest this miserable food. They are talking about the manna. The supernatural provision that appeared every morning on the ground. Fine, white, flake-like, tasting of honey according to the earlier description in Exodus. The food that no one in the camp had to plant or harvest or purchase. The food that simply came every single morning, without fail, for years. And now they detested it. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is easy to read this from a distance and feel a certain superiority. To think, how ungrateful, how faithless, how could they possibly complain about miraculous provision? But the truth is more uncomfortable than that. Because the people were not complaining about something bad. They were complaining about something good that had become invisible through repetition. There is a psychological reality here that has been documented and observed and written about by philosophers and spiritual teachers across every tradition throughout human history. The human capacity for adaptation is extraordinary. We are built to normalize. We are built to stop noticing. The things that once filled us with wonder and gratitude become, over time, simply the background of our lives, expected, assumed, not worth remarking on. The house that felt like a miracle when you first moved in becomes just where you live. The relationship that once filled every day with a sense of gift becomes just the arrangement you are in. The provision that came supernaturally every morning and kept an entire nation alive becomes just what you eat for breakfast. This is not unique to the people of Israel, this is the human condition. But the consequence of it in this story is that the people have arrived at a place where they cannot see what is holding them, where the grace they are swimming in has become invisible, where the complaints they were holding back are now louder than any awareness of how much they have been given, and they have spoken those complaints aloud, against God, against Moses, into the desert air of the wilderness, where the words hang for a moment and then dissipate into the heat. Part 3, the serpents come. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among the people, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. The directness of that sequence in the text is, on first reading, almost shocking. There is no warning. There is no intermediary prophetic voice. There is no lengthy divine speech explaining the logic of what is about to happen. There is simply the complaint, and then the snakes. Now, for the modern reader, this raises immediate questions. Questions about the character of God. Questions about proportionality. Questions about what kind of divine being sends deadly serpents in response to people complaining about food. These are not dishonest questions. They are not faithless questions. They are the questions of people who take the text seriously enough to wrestle with it, rather than smooth over its difficult edges. And the wrestling is worthwhile, because what is happening here is not simply punishment. It is something more complex and more interesting than punishment. The Sinai Desert was and is home to a number of extremely dangerous snake species. The saw-scaled viper, Echis carinatus, is considered one of the most dangerous snakes in the world and is native to the region. It is small, easily overlooked, quick to strike, and its venom causes internal bleeding that, without modern medical treatment, is frequently fatal. The desert horned viper, the Palestinian viper, the Egyptian cobra. These were not mythological creatures imported for narrative convenience. They were real residents of the landscape through which Israel was walking. which raises a different possibility than the one that is usually considered. What if the snakes were not sent in the sense of being conjured from nothing? What if they were always there, at the margins of the camp, in the rock formations, in the dry grass at the edge of the tents? And what changed was not their presence, but the protection that had been quietly holding them back. The people had been moving through snake country for years, and until this moment, according to the text, the serpents had not been a significant problem, which is remarkable, because in the natural order of things, a large encampment of people moving through desert terrain, occupied by multiple species of highly venomous snakes, would expect to have regular casualties. The absence of those casualties, over years of wilderness travel, was itself a form of protection, a grace, one that the people had never thought to name, because they had never experienced its absence. Now they did. The serpents came into the camp, people were bitten, and the text says, with a weight that does not diminish with reading, many died. Many. The text does not give us numbers. The biblical narrative is not always interested in precise statistics, but the word many is not casual. It means the death was significant. It means the grief was widespread. It means that the camp, which hours before had been filled with the sound of complaint, was now filled with something entirely different. Think about what that would have looked like. Think about the specific, terrible progression of a venomous snakebite in the ancient world, without antivenin, without modern medicine, without intravenous fluids or any of the interventions we would reach for today. The bite itself, often sudden, often not seen coming, a sharp pain in an ankle or a wrist or a calf, the 2 small puncture marks, the immediate swelling, then the spreading pain, moving up the limb in the hours that followed, the fever, the disorientation, the progression that, with a saw-scaled viper, included the ominous sign of bleeding that would not stop, from the gums, from the nose, from small wounds that should have clotted, and then, for many, the end. The camp of Israel had been filled with the sound of complaint. Now it was filled with the sound of dying, and with the particular silence that falls when people who have been talking suddenly have nothing left to say. There is a profound irony embedded in the structure of what has happened. The people had complained that the manna was miserable, that God's provision was insufficient, that what they had been given was not good enough, not satisfying, not what they really wanted. And now, surrounded by the consequence of that complaint, they understood something they had not understood before. The manna was not the only thing that had been given to them. Safety in a dangerous landscape, that had been given to them too. Passage through snake country without the snakes noticing, that had been given to them too. The 1,000 invisible protections that make it possible to walk through a wilderness and not be destroyed by it, those had been given to them too, and they had never, not once, felt grateful for any of it. Because you cannot be grateful for what you cannot see. Now they could see, now they understood what had been holding the desert at bay. And in that understanding, the complaints went very, very quiet. Part 4. The Return. Then the people came to Moses. 4 words. But in those 4 words, there is a world of movement, a world of decision, a world of what it cost them to cross the distance between where they had been, complaining, accusing, speaking against both God and Moses, and where they needed to be. Moses was not simply their leader in the administrative sense. Moses was the man they had been accusing. Moses was the man they had blamed for the detour around Edom, for the lack of water, for the miserable manna. Moses was the one they had spoken against in the same breath as God. To come to Moses now, to walk through the camp with its grief and its dead and its fear, and to stand before the man they had been blaming and say what they needed to say, this was not a small thing. Pride is a powerful force. It is one of the most powerful forces in the human interior. The pride that prevents the first step toward the person you have wronged. The pride that makes you look for a way to be not quite responsible, not quite culpable, not quite the one who has to go and say the thing that needs to be said. The people of Israel had been complaining for a long time. They had been building a case in their minds and in their words for the position that what had been done to them was unjust, that the manna was truly insufficient, that the detour was truly unjust, that the God who had led them out of Egypt was not in fact adequately caring for them. That case had just collapsed. It had collapsed in the most brutal and undeniable way possible, in the form of serpents and death, and now there was nothing to do with it. The case was gone, and what was left was the truth that the case had been covering. They came to Moses, and they said, "We have sinned. We spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." There is no hedging in this confession. There is no attempt to retain some portion of the complaint, to say, well, we may have been a bit harsh, but you have to admit the manner really is getting monotonous. There is none of that. There is only the direct, unadorned acknowledgement. We sinned. The action was wrong. Not just unfortunate, not just excessive, not just poorly timed. Wrong. This is what genuine repentance looks like. It is not the performance of remorse. It is not the strategic acknowledgement of fault in order to obtain a desired outcome. Well, there is a prayer in here, a petition for the serpents to be taken away, so perhaps the motivation is not entirely pure. But what precedes the petition is honest. The naming of the sin before the asking of the favour. The willingness to stand in the truth of what they had done before requesting that the consequences be altered. And Moses? Here is the extraordinary thing about Moses. Moses, who had been bearing the weight of this nation for years. Moses, who had absorbed complaint after complaint, accusation after accusation, who had been blamed for things that were not his fault, and criticised for decisions that God had directed him to make. Moses, who was himself a deeply human person with human limits and human frustrations, who had had his own moments of failure in the wilderness. Moses did not hesitate. He did not say anything like, "Well, I told you so," or "I am glad you're finally acknowledging what has been apparent to me for years." He did not lecture them or require them to elaborate on their wrongdoing or demonstrate the sincerity of their repentance. He prayed. Moses prayed for the people. That is the whole sentence. Moses prayed for the people. 4 words that contain an entire theology of intercession, of what it means to stand between a people and the consequences of their failure, and to lift them up in the only way you have available, with words spoken to the one who can actually do something about it. Moses was not a perfect man. He had his own failures, some of them severe, but in this moment he was exactly what an intercessor is supposed to be. A person who, regardless of what has been done to them, chooses to stand in the gap, chooses to carry the needs of others before the throne of the one who has the power to meet those needs, chooses, in the simplest possible terms, to pray. Part 5. The Strange and Unexpected Answer. The Lord answered Moses, but not in the way anyone had asked. The people had asked for the serpents to be taken away. That was the petition. Remove the snakes, end the dying, restore the safety that had existed before the complaints opened this door. That was what they wanted. It was a reasonable request. More than reasonable, it was the obvious thing to ask for. If the problem is venomous serpents, the solution is the removal of venomous serpents. The logic is clean and simple. God did not do that. Instead, God said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. Make a snake." Specifically, the text tells us elsewhere, a bronze snake, fashioned from the same material as some of the sacred vessels of the tabernacle, shaped into the form of the very creature that was killing the people. Place it on a pole, high enough to be seen, high enough that a person anywhere in the camp, in any condition, could lift their eyes and find it, and then tell the people, "If you are bitten, look at it. That is all. Look at it and live. Now." We need to spend some time here because this instruction is genuinely strange, and the strangeness is not accidental. The strangeness is the point. There are things that God could have done in response to the prayer of Moses that would have made more sense by normal human logic. God could have simply healed the bitten directly. No pole required, no bronze serpent required, no action required from the people at all. Just a wave of healing moving through the camp, the way a number of other healings in the biblical narrative work. Or God could have taken away the serpents, as the people had asked, and allowed natural healing to take its course for those who had already been bitten. Or God could have provided some herbal antidote, some medical instruction, some remedy that would have addressed the biological reality of the venom in a straightforward way. Instead, God chose the strange thing, the counterintuitive thing, the thing that, when you first hear it, makes you do a small double take and read it again. Make a bronze snake, put it on a pole, tell the bitten to look at it. Why? The answer begins with what the pole was not. It was not a talisman. It was not a magical object with inherent healing properties. It was not a religious icon to be worshipped or appeased. The text is clear about this in a later passage in 2 Kings, where we learn that the bronze serpent Moses made was eventually destroyed by the king Hezekiah because the Israelites had started burning incense to it. They had turned it into an idol, and when that happened, Hezekiah smashed it and called it Nehushtan, which roughly translates as nothing but a piece of bronze. A piece of bronze. The thing itself was not holy. The thing itself had no power. It was just shaped metal on a stick. What the pole was, the function it served, the reason God gave this specific instruction rather than some other, was a focus for faith. A concrete, specific, visible object that translated the abstract act of trust into something a frightened, bitten, possibly dying person could actually do with their body. Because faith, in the abstract, can be very difficult when you are scared, when you are in pain, when you have been bitten and you can feel the venom beginning its slow work and you're not sure whether you will see tomorrow morning. In that state, the instruction to trust God is, what? It is true, it is important, but it is also very hard to know what it looks like. What does trusting God actually mean when you are lying on the ground with a snake bite in your ankle? God gave them a concrete answer to that question. It means, get up, or let someone carry you and go to where the pole is, and then lift your eyes and look. That is the whole instruction. No prayer required, no formula required, no theological knowledge required, no spiritual resume required, no proof of prior faithfulness, no demonstration of sufficient repentance, no minimum number of good deeds, just the physical, embodied, simple act of turning your face upward and looking at the bronze serpent on the pole. Part 6. The symbolism hidden in the shape. But there is something else here that deserves careful attention. Something in the specific form of what was placed on the pole. God did not instruct Moses to make a golden dove. He did not instruct him to make a flame, or a star, or any of the other symbols of divine presence that appear elsewhere in the sacred texts of Israel. He instructed him to make a snake. The snake. The same kind of creature that was killing them. The symbol of the problem was made into the symbol of the solution. The thing that carried death was transformed in its lifted, visible, bronzed form into the thing that gave life. The very image of what had bitten you was what you had to look at in order to be healed. This is a deeply layered image, and it resonates in ways that go far beyond the immediate narrative context. Because there is something true in it about the nature of healing itself. The truth that healing often requires looking directly at the thing that has hurt you, rather than away from it. That the turn toward the wound, rather than away from it, is frequently where recovery begins. The person who has been betrayed needs to look clearly at what happened rather than minimize it or bury it in order to move forward. The person who has been carrying grief that they have not allowed themselves to fully feel, and who needs to sit in the presence of that grief in order to eventually come through it. The person who has been nursing a habit or a pattern of thought or a way of relating to the world that is slowly doing damage, and who needs to see it clearly before anything can change. In all of these situations, the healing does not come from looking away. It comes from the willingness to look directly at what is true, as painful and as ugly as that truth might be, and to hold it in the gaze long enough for something to shift. The bronze serpent on the pole was, in this sense, a deeply wise form of mercy. It did not remove the reality of the serpents from the camp. It did not pretend that what had not happened. It did not offer healing through denial. It offered healing through directed, trusting, eyes-open acknowledgement of exactly what the situation was. The snakes were real. The bites were real. The venom was real, and the only way through was not around any of that reality, but directly through it, with eyes lifted toward the one who had provided the way. And there is something else in the shape of the bronze serpent that is worth considering. The serpent as a symbol has a long and complicated history in the ancient Near East. In many cultures surrounding Israel, the serpent was associated with wisdom, with healing, with hidden knowledge. The caduceus, the staff entwined with serpents that is still used as a symbol of medicine today, comes from a tradition in which the serpent represented healing power. The Egyptians, from whose land Israel had just come, had complex and important serpent symbolism woven throughout their religious iconography. God chose this symbol deliberately. He did not choose it because serpent symbolism from neighbouring cultures was being imported into Israelite practice. He chose it because in the specific context of this specific crisis, it was the right symbol. The lifted serpent represented the transformation of the thing that kills into the thing that heals, the conversion of venom into antidote, the strange alchemy of a God who does not simply remove suffering but redeems it, who takes the very form of the problem and places it where it can become part of the solution. Part 7. The walk toward the pole. Now let us walk through the experience of the person in the camp, the bitten one, the one who has heard the instruction. You have been bitten. Maybe it happened in the morning, when you stepped out of your tent before the ground was fully light, and your foot came down near a rock where something was resting in the cooler air. Maybe it happened in the afternoon, reaching for something that had fallen near a scrub of dry brush. You felt the sharp, sudden, unmistakable pain. You looked down, and you saw the 2 small marks on your skin, and you felt the knowledge of what they meant settle over you like a stone. People around you have already been bitten. Some of them have already died. You know what this means. You know the progression, and you know that there is nothing in the camp, no healer, no herb, no remedy that has proven itself against the venom of these particular snakes. And then someone comes to you and tells you what Moses has said, that there is a pole at the centre of the camp, that there is a bronze serpent on that pole, and that if you look at it, if you go to it and look at it, you will live. What do you do with that? The rational mind, the mind that is accustomed to cause and effect, to remedies that make sense, to the idea that the treatment should bear some logical relationship to the disease. The rational mind has trouble with this. Looking at a bronze snake is not a medical intervention. Looking at a bronze snake does not neutralize venom. Looking at a piece of metal on a stick does nothing that medicine understands as doing something. But you have been bitten. And the people who have been bitten without looking at the pole have been dying. And the people who have been bitten and have gone to the pole and looked, those people are walking back to their tents. Those people are sitting down and drinking water and breathing normally. Those people are alive. So what do? This is the exact texture of faith. Not the comfortable, abstract, easy faith of a person who has not yet been asked to do anything strange. The faith of a person who is scared and in pain, and facing the choice between doing the thing that makes no sense and doing nothing, which ends in death. You go to the pole, or someone helps you there, and you stand in front of it, or maybe you're lying on the ground and someone has turned your face upward, or maybe you're on someone's back being carried, and you look up. You find the bronze serpent in the air above you, catching the light of the afternoon, and you look at it, and something changes. What exactly changes? The text does not tell us. The mechanism of healing is not explained. There is no detailed account of how the bronze serpent on a pole neutralized the venom of an actual snake bite. The text simply tells us that anyone who was bitten could look at the bronze snake and live. The act of looking was not merely external, it was internal. The person who looked was performing, with their body, the same act they were performing with their soul. They were turning away from self-reliance. They were lifting their gaze off their own wound, off their own fear, off their own desperate reckoning with a situation they could not fix themselves, and they were directing that gaze outward and upward towards something that God had provided, toward the strange, ugly, uncomfortable symbol of the very thing that had hurt them, lifted up where everyone could see it. That act, that simple, bodily, chosen act of turning and looking, was faith, the most elemental, most accessible, most basic form of faith. You didn't have to be a scholar. You did not have to be a priest. You did not have to have a long history of faithful obedience. You did not have to be young or strong or well regarded in the camp. You only had to be willing to look, to turn your face in the direction of the thing that had been provided, to trust, even without understanding that the word you'd been given was true. Part 8. What the camp looked like. When the dying stopped. Slowly over the course of that terrible afternoon, the dying stopped. The bronze serpent on the pole stood at the centre of the camp, visible from all parts of it, catching and releasing the light as the sun moved through the sky. And one by one, the bitten made their way to it, or were carried to it, or turned their faces toward it from where they lay. And one by one, the venom that should have killed them did not kill them. This is worth imagining in its specific human detail. Because the story does not end at the pole. The story ends in the tents, where the healed people return. Where the mothers who had been preparing themselves for the worst found their children breathing normally. Where the old men who had been bitten in the morning and carried to the pole in the afternoon sat down in the evening and ate their supper, the manna, the miserable food, and found it adequate after all. Where the families that had not yet lost anyone held each other in the cooling desert air and felt the specific, precious, often overlooked gratitude of people who have just been reminded what it means to still be alive. The grief in the camp was real. There were those who had died before the pole was raised, or who had not been told in time, or who, for whatever reason the text does not explain, had not looked. The camp did not emerge from this episode without scars. The wilderness never returned any of them without scars. But the spreading death had stopped. The crisis that had been advancing through the tents like fire across dry ground had been arrested. And the serpents that were still in the desert, they were still there. God did not take them away. The text gives us no indication that the saw-scaled vipers suddenly packed up and left the Sinai wilderness because the crisis in the Israelite camp was over. The danger remained. The wilderness was still dangerous. The lesson of the pole was not that the threat no longer existed. It was that the threat no longer had the final word, that death was not the last thing available to a person who had been bitten, that between the bite and the grave there was still the pole, there was still the act of looking up, there was still the strange, unglamorous, deeply effective mercy of the bronze serpent. Part 9. The Echo Across 1,000 Years. The story in Numbers 21 is complete in itself. It is a complete narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It does not require a sequel to be meaningful, and for many centuries, for many readers, it was simply what it appeared to be. An episode from the wilderness wandering, a lesson about gratitude and consequence and the strange forms that divine mercy can take. But then, in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John, something remarkable happened. Jesus was speaking with a religious leader named Nicodemus, a Pharisee, a member of the ruling council, a man who came to Jesus by night, privately, because he was not ready to make his interest in this teacher a public matter. They were having a conversation about what it meant to be born again, about the work of the Spirit, about the mysterious ways in which the divine presence moves in human lives. And in the middle of that conversation, Jesus said, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life." He was talking about the cross. He was looking backward across more than 1,000 years of history and saying, that story in the wilderness, the serpents, the dying, the pole, the looking up and living, that was not just about snakes. That was a shadow, a preview, a picture drawn in bronze and desert light, and the terror of a bitten people that was pointing forward to something far larger. The correspondences between the two stories are precise, and they are not accidental. In both stories, the problem is real, and the consequences are deadly. In Numbers 21, the serpents and their venom are real. The death spreading through the camp is real. In the Gospel of John, and in the larger theological framework Jesus was teaching from, The brokenness of the human condition is real. The thing that the New Testament calls sin, the fracture in the human relationship with God, the persistent turning away from life toward death, is real. Both stories begin with a genuine crisis, not a theoretical one. In both stories, the solution involves something being lifted up. Moses lifted up the bronze serpent on a pole, raising it to a height where it could be seen by anyone in the camp. Jesus was lifted up on the cross, an instrument of execution, publicly displayed, visible to everyone. In both cases, the act of being lifted up was not triumphant in any obvious worldly sense. A bronze replica of a poisonous snake is not a beautiful symbol of victory. A Roman crucifixion is not a beautiful symbol of anything. But in both cases, the lifting up was precisely the point. It was the act of making visible the thing that would heal. In both stories, the form that is lifted up takes on the nature of the very problem it addresses. Moses lifted up a snake, the same species, or a representation of the same species, as the thing that was killing the people. Jesus was lifted up as a human being who, according to the theological claims of the New Testament, had taken onto himself the full weight and consequence of human brokenness. In both cases, the thing that kills has been transformed, in its lifted form, into the thing that gives life. And in both stories, the act of healing requires looking, turning toward, lifting your eyes, a specific, chosen, embodied response to what has been provided. In Numbers, the bitten person had to look at the bronze serpent. In John, those who believe in the lifted up Son of Man receive eternal life. Different vocabulary, different scale, different stakes, but the same structure, the same fundamental act of trust, the same willingness to turn your eyes toward the strange and unexpected thing that God has provided, even when that thing does not match your prior expectations of what salvation should look like. The bronze serpent was not supposed to make sense. It was not supposed to follow the logic of medical treatment or rational cause and effect. It was supposed to be something you looked at because God told you to look at it, and because the people who looked were living, and the people who did not were dying. And at some point the evidence becomes sufficient to justify the act of trust even in the absence of the explanation. And the cross, which is foolishness, Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians to those who are perishing, the cross was not supposed to make sense either. Not the kind of sense that military victory makes, or political revolution, or philosophical argument. It was supposed to be the kind of sense that a bronze serpent on a pole in the wilderness makes. The kind of sense that you can only find by first being willing to admit that you are bitten, that the venom is in your blood, that you cannot fix it yourself, and that the only thing available to you is to look up. Part 10. The themes that outlast the story. There are several threads running through this story that are worth drawing out slowly here at the end, as the night deepens and the weight of the day continues to lift from you. The first is the theme of invisible provision. The people of Israel could not be grateful for what they could not see. The serpents that were not biting them, the snakes that were held back year after year while they moved through dangerous territory, those were invisible to them. And because they were invisible, they were not counted, not acknowledged, not received as the gift they were. It is only in the absence of the protection that the protection becomes real to those who had it. This is one of the most quietly painful aspects of the human experience. We are surrounded, most of us, by an extraordinary amount of invisible good. The disaster that did not happen, the disease that did not develop, the accident that was narrowly avoided, the relationship that held when it could have broken, the ordinary morning that arrived on schedule when somewhere in the world someone else's ordinary morning did not. We are not built, in our ordinary functioning, to perceive these things as gifts. We are built to perceive them as background, as the neutral baseline of a life that has not yet been harmed. And so we miss them. And in missing them, we miss a vast portion of the gratitude that is available to us on any given day. The lesson of the wilderness is not that you should manufacture a constant state of ecstatic thankfulness for everything that is going well. That is not realistic, and it is not what the story is asking of us. The lesson is simpler and more sustainable than that. The lesson is to notice, to occasionally deliberately look at what is holding you up. to take a breath and acknowledge the provision that is easy to take for granted because it has never failed yet. The manna that came this morning, the safety of the night just past, the health that is ordinary for you and would be extraordinary for someone else, the people who are still here. The second theme is the anatomy of repentance. The people came to Moses and said 3 things. We have sinned. We spoke against the Lord and against you. Please pray that the Lord will take the snakes away. In those 3 sentences, there is a complete architecture of genuine turning. There is the acknowledgement of the wrong. We have sinned. There is the specification of the wrong. We spoke against the Lord and against you. And there is the request for help. Pray for us, in that order. The acknowledgement and the specification come before the request. The willingness to stand in the truth of what has been done comes before the petition for relief. This is not a legalistic formula. It is not a procedure that, if performed correctly, unlocks divine favour like a combination lock. It is an honest description of what genuine turning looks like in the human heart. You cannot truly ask for help with something you have not truly seen. You cannot genuinely reach toward restoration without first genuinely looking at the fracture. The repentance of Israel in this story is real because it is not minimized, not hedged, not accompanied by an asterisk. We sinned. 3 words, the whole story. The third theme is the shape of faith. The Bronze Serpent episode is one of the clearest, simplest illustrations of what faith actually is, not as a theological concept, but as a lived reality. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is not the certainty that things will work out in the specific way you want them to. It is not the confident expectation that God will behave according to your predictions. Faith is the act of turning toward the provision you have been given, even when the provision does not match your expectations, even when it looks strange, even when it requires you to look at the very thing that hurt you. Faith is the moment when you've exhausted all the other options and you get up, or you let someone carry you, and you go to the pole. Part 11. The quiet of the desert night. The night has come down over the camp of Israel. The fires are small now, burning low after the long and terrible day. The sky above the Sinai wilderness is doing what the sky above the Sinai wilderness always does when the sun goes down, filling from edge to edge with stars. More stars than you have ever seen if you have lived your whole life in a city. More stars than seem possible, pressing through the dark in their ancient arrangements, the same stars that look down on Abraham and on Jacob and on Joseph and on all the long line of these people stretching back through the centuries. In the tents, the ones who were bitten and looked and lived are sleeping. Their bodies are doing the work of healing, real, physical, cellular healing, the kind that requires rest and time and the quiet cooperation of every system working to restore what the venom tried to undo. They are sleeping the sleep of people who were not sure this morning that they would see this evening. That sleep has a particular quality to it. It is deeper than the sleep of a person who has never been in danger. It is the sleep of someone who knows, in a way they did not know before, that sleep is not guaranteed, that the morning is a gift. Moses is awake, probably. Moses is often awake when the camp sleeps. The burden of leadership, the weight of carrying an entire people before God, of being the interface between the human and the divine, of praying and arbitrating and bearing and mediating, that burden does not easily put itself down at the end of the day. Moses knows what happened today. He knows what the people said and what came of it and what he built and what God did. He is sitting in the desert dark with all of that knowledge, and he is, what? Tired. Always tired. But also perhaps something quieter, something that comes after the terrible day has passed and the ones who are dying have lived, and the pole is standing at the centre of the camp, and the night has arrived with its stars and its cold and its reliable, beautiful silence. There is a young woman in one of the tents who was bitten in the early afternoon. She was bitten on her right hand, reaching for something she had dropped near the base of a rock. She is 17 years old. She was born in the wilderness, born to parents who had been slaves in Egypt and who walked out under the pillar of cloud and have never gone back. She has never seen Egypt. She has never seen Canaan. She knows only this life of tent and manna and the long, slow procession through the desert. She has been impatient for the promised land in the way that only someone who has never had a home can be impatient. Not with resentment exactly, but with an ache. This afternoon, someone carried her to the pole. Her father, probably strong and frightened in equal measure, moving through the camp with her on his back, talking to her the whole way in the low, urgent voice that fathers use when they are very scared. The pole was tall enough to be visible above the tents. The bronze serpent at the top of it caught the afternoon light and gleamed with a colour that was neither warm nor cold, and she looked at it. Her father's voice said, look up, and she looked up, and the thing that had been spreading up her arm from the bite on her hand slowed, and then stopped, and then began impossibly to reverse. She is asleep now. Her hand still aches. It will ache for several days. Healing is not instantaneous. Even miraculous healing leaves a mark. But she is breathing, and tomorrow morning she will wake up and step out of the tent into the desert sunrise, and the manna will be on the ground as it always is, and she will pick it up and eat it, and it will taste like it always tastes, like honey, like something that has been given. Part 12. Looking up. You're in your own wilderness tonight. You may not know its name. You may not be able to see the end of it from where you're standing. The detour may have been going on long enough that you have stopped expecting it to end. The road may have turned south when you needed it to go north, and you may have been walking south long enough that south has started to feel permanent. Maybe you have complained. Maybe the manna has started to taste like not enough. Maybe the provision that has held you up through every hard season has become so familiar that you have stopped counting it as provision and started counting it as baseline, and somewhere in that shift the gratitude went quiet and something harder and colder took its place. That is a human thing. That is not a shameful thing. That is the thing that happens when the extraordinary becomes ordinary through sheer repetition, and the soul gets shortened by a long road through difficult terrain. Maybe you have been bitten by grief, or by fear, or by the slow poison of something you did not choose and cannot fix, by the discovery that a relationship was not what you thought it was, by the loss of something you built with enormous care, by the long grinding weight of a life that has more hard days than easy ones and seems to hold that proportion with no intention of reversing it, by the specific quiet despair of a person who has been trying for a very long time and is not sure what they are trying toward anymore. The pole is still standing. It has always been standing in one form or another. The specific, personal, embodied provision that is available to you in this exact moment of your exact life. The thing that God has raised up at the center of the camp and said, look at this and live. You do not have to understand it. You do not have to understand why the thing that looks like your wound has been turned into the thing that heals it. You do not have to have a complete theology of grace before you are allowed to access it. You do not have to be strong enough to walk there on your own. You can be carried. You only have to look up. The act of looking up is not complicated. It does not require previous experience or prior credentialing or sufficient spiritual preparation. It requires the willingness to lift your eyes off your own wound, off your own fear, off the assessment of your own resources and their inadequacy, and to turn them toward the thing that has been provided outside yourself. It requires the simple, elemental, accessible act of trust that says, I cannot fix this, and I'm going to stop trying to fix it, and I'm going to look up. And in looking up, in that simple, strange, sometimes slightly absurd feeling act of directing your gaze towards something you cannot fully explain, something changes, not all at once usually, not dramatically usually, but something, some small shift in the interior landscape, some settling, some easing, some almost imperceptible movement from the position of a person carrying something alone to the position of a person who has just remembered that they do not have to carry it alone. The wilderness is still the wilderness. The serpents are still in the desert. The road is still long. But the pole is standing at the center of the camp, and it has been provided, and you are allowed to use it. Part 13. The Long Rest. Let the camp of Israel settle into the night around you. Let the fires burn low. Let the sound of the desert take over. The wind moving through the dry grass at the edge of the camp. The distant call of something in the dark. The way the cold air of the desert night settles into the silence with a completeness that no other silence quite matches. The bronze serpent on the pole is still there. It will be there tomorrow morning when the manna comes and the camp stirs and the procession begins again. It will catch the morning light the way it caught the afternoon light and the evening light. It will be the same object it was this morning and this afternoon. Shaped metal on a pole, the image of a serpent, an unlikely instrument of an unlikely mercy. Nothing about it will have changed, and yet everything will have changed, because the people who looked at it, the people who were bitten and frightened and probably very sceptical and who went anyway and looked up anyway, those people are lying in their tents right now with the knowledge of something that cannot be untaught. The knowledge that the God who sustains them in the wilderness is not a God who removes every danger before they have to face it. Not a God who guarantees smooth roads and clear skies and the perpetual absence of venomous serpents. But a God who, in the middle of the danger, in the middle of the serpents, in the middle of the dying, provides. Provides strangely. Provides in ways that do not always make obvious sense. Provides in ways that require something of you. A specific, bodily, chosen act of turning toward what has been given. Provides, nonetheless. That knowledge is not comfortable exactly. It is not the comfortable knowledge of guaranteed safety. It is the different, deeper, harder-won knowledge of a people who have seen the mercy at work in the middle of the crisis, who have watched the venom stop spreading in the arm of someone who should have died, who have felt their own legs carry them back to their tent when their own legs, 20 minutes ago, could barely stand. It is the knowledge of people who have looked up, and who live to tell about it. The stars above the Sinai wilderness are extraordinary tonight. They always are. Billions of points of ancient light, arranged in their familiar and unfamiliar patterns. The same stars that have watched every generation of wanderers make their way through every kind of wilderness that human beings have ever walked through. They do not comment, they do not judge, they simply shine from their impossible distances into the dark over the camp where a tired and chastened and grateful and healing people are settling into sleep. And somewhere in the dark, not far and not distant and not removed behind the sky, the same presence that sustained them yesterday and will sustain them tomorrow is present in the night of today. Not in the thunder, not in the dramatic display, in the quiet, in the cold, in the way the stars press through the dark, in the way the manna will appear again in the morning, as it has appeared every morning, as it will appear again tomorrow, as it will appear for as long as they need it, in the presence of a God who does not always remove the serpents, but who always provides the pole, and who is asking tonight, as he has always asked, not for a great demonstration of religious fervour, not for an elaborate performance of devotion, not for anything complicated or expensive or difficult to obtain, just to look up, just to turn your face wherever you are toward what has been provided, to lift your eyes off the wound and onto the pole, to trust, in the simplest and most vulnerable and most human way available to you, that the word you have been given is true. You are held tonight. Whether or not you can feel it, whether or not the circumstances of your life currently support the sensation of being held, the holding is real. The manna will come tomorrow. The provision that you have been receiving without noticing it will continue without noticing you not noticing it. The protection at the margins of your life, the invisible kind, the kind you will only know about if you ever stop having it, that is present too. You do not have to earn your way to the pole. You only have to go there. Sleep now. Rest in the quiet of the desert that has held wanderers for 10,000 years and will hold them for 10,000 more. Let the weight of the day go. Let the concerns that will wait until morning wait until morning. Let the questions that do not have answers tonight remain unanswered for a few more hours, while the deep and necessary work of rest does what only rest can do. The pole is standing. You have looked up. And for tonight, that is enough. There are moments in history when oppression becomes so familiar that it stops feeling like oppression at all. It becomes normal, expected, the way things simply are. The Israelites knew this feeling intimately. For 18 years they had bent their backs under Moabite rule. For 18 years they had watched their grain carried away in tribute wagons. For 18 years they had lowered their eyes when Moabite soldiers passed through their villages. 18 years is long enough for children to grow into adults who have never known freedom. Long enough for hope to become a dangerous luxury. Long enough for the memory of liberation to fade into stories told by the elderly. Stories that sound more like fairy tales with each passing season. But something changes when a people reach the edge of their endurance, when the weight becomes too much, when the silence finally breaks. This is the story of Ehud, a man history almost forgot. A left-handed member of the tribe of Benjamin who carried tribute to a king and returned with deliverance. His story appears in just 11 verses of the book of Judges chapter 3, 11 verses that contain an assassination, an escape, a rallying cry, and a military victory that would bring 80 years of peace. Yet the brevity of the biblical account belies the complexity of what actually happened. Behind those 11 verses lies a world of careful planning, extraordinary courage, and a moment of violence that would echo through generations. This is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story about the cost of freedom, the nature of divine justice, and the unexpected vessels through which deliverance sometimes arrives. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of King Eglon of Moab. We examine the 18 years of tribute and taxation that brought Israel to its knees. We analyse the strategic genius of a plan so audacious it could only have been attempted once. And we ask the questions that linger long after the story ends. How does deliverance come when oppression feels permanent? What does it mean when violence becomes the instrument of liberation? And why does God so often choose the overlooked, the unlikely, and the unexpected to accomplish what entire armies cannot? The answers begin not with Ehud, but with the cycles of faith and failure that defined an entire era. Chapter 1. The pattern that repeats. The book of Judges records one of the most difficult periods in Israel's history. It was a time between the conquest under Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy under Saul. A time when, as the text repeatedly states, there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This was not freedom, it was chaos. The pattern emerged almost immediately after Joshua's death. The generation that had witnessed the miracles of the Exodus and the conquest began to pass away. Their children and grandchildren grew up in the Promised Land, but they did not grow up with the same devotion to the covenant. They did not remember Egypt. They had not crossed the Jordan. They had not seen the walls of Jericho fall. And so they drifted. The drift was gradual. It always is. First came tolerance of the Canaanite religious practices that surrounded them. Then came participation. Then came adoption. The worship of Baal and Asherah crept into Israelite homes. Altars to foreign gods appeared on hilltops. Intermarriage with surrounding nations became common. The theological framework of Judges presents this as covenant violation. Israel had been called to be distinct, to maintain their identity as God's people, to worship the Lord alone. Each compromise weakened that identity. Each generation strayed further from the covenant their ancestors had made, and each time the consequences followed. The cycle became depressingly predictable. Israel would abandon God. God would remove his protection. A neighbouring nation would invade and establish dominance. Years of oppression would follow. Eventually Israel would cry out to God in desperation. God would raise up a judge, a deliverer to free them. Peace would return for a generation. Then the cycle would begin again. Othniel delivered them from Aram Naharaim. 40 years of peace followed his victory. But after his death, the familiar drift began anew. The Israelites again did evil in the sight of the Lord. They turned away from his commands. They forgot the covenant. And so the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel. This detail is crucial. The text does not present Eglon as simply a powerful ruler who happened to invade. It presents him as an instrument of divine judgment. God strengthened him. God allowed his conquest. The oppression that would follow was not random geopolitical misfortune. It was consequence. But consequence, in the theological world of Judges, is never the final word. Consequence creates the conditions for repentance. Suffering turns hearts back toward God, and when genuine repentance occurs, deliverance follows. The question is never whether deliverance will come. The question is how long it will take for the people to cry out, and through whom deliverance will arrive when they finally do. Chapter 2. The king who conquered Jericho. Eglon, king of Moab, enters the biblical narrative as a figure of considerable power. Moab lay east of the Dead Sea, across the Jordan River from Israelite territory. Under normal circumstances, the Moabites and Israelites maintained an uneasy coexistence, neither strong enough to dominate the other. But these were not normal circumstances. God had strengthened Eglon, and the king moved to capitalize on Israel's spiritual disarray. He did not move alone. The text tells us that Eglon formed alliances with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. These were not casual partnerships. They were strategic military coalitions designed to maximize pressure on Israel from multiple directions. The Ammonites controlled territory to the northeast. The Amalekites, Israel's ancient enemies, ranged through the southern wilderness. Together, this coalition could squeeze Israel between multiple fronts. The target they selected was highly symbolic: Jericho, the city of palms. Jericho held enormous psychological significance for Israel. It had been the first city conquered when Joshua led the people across the Jordan. Its walls had fallen without a single siege weapon, without battering rams or scaling ladders. The victory had been miraculous, a demonstration of divine power that set the tone for the entire conquest. Now those walls stood again, rebuilt in the years since Joshua's time, and Eglon took them. The capture of Jericho was more than a military achievement. It was a statement. The site of Israel's first great victory under God's leadership now served as the seat of their oppression. The place where God had demonstrated his power now housed the throne of their conqueror. Eglon established his palace there, in the rebuilt city. The biblical text describes him as a very wealthy man, and archaeology confirms that Moabite kings of this period controlled significant trade routes and agricultural resources. The palace at Jericho would have reflected this wealth. Cool upper rooms designed to catch the breeze from the Jordan Valley, guard posts at every entrance, courtyards where tribute would be received and inventoried. From this fortified position, Eglon extended his control over the surrounding region. Israelite settlements that had once been free now found themselves under foreign administration. Moabite officials collected taxes. Moabite soldiers patrolled the roads. Moabite law governed disputes. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Ancient Near Eastern tribute systems were designed to extract maximum wealth while maintaining just enough economic activity to keep the tribute flowing. Farmers had to surrender a portion of every harvest. Shepherds lost sheep and goats from their flocks. Craftsmen saw their finest work requisitioned for the palace. But the economic burden, heavy as it was, represented only one dimension of the oppression. Cultural suppression followed economic control. Israelite religious practices faced restriction. Gathering for worship became difficult when movement was monitored. Maintaining distinct covenant identity became challenging when Moabite culture saturated daily life. Over time, this created a crisis of identity. What did it mean to be God's chosen people when they lived under foreign domination? What did it mean to trust in divine protection when no protection came? How could they claim a special relationship with the Lord when their conquerors seemed to prosper while they suffered? These questions had no easy answers, and so many stopped asking them. They accepted their situation, they paid their tribute, they kept their heads down and tried to survive. 18 years passed this way. 18 years of tribute wagons rolling toward Jericho loaded with grain and livestock and oil. 18 years of watching wealth flow out of their communities into Moabite coffers. 18 years of diminished hope and increasing resignation. Children born in the first year of Eglon's rule were now approaching adulthood, having known nothing but Moabite domination. The elderly who remembered independence were dying off. The collective memory of freedom was fading. This is how oppression becomes normal. Not through dramatic acts of violence, though those certainly occurred, but through the slow, grinding weight of years. Through the gradual acceptance that this is simply how things are. Through the death of imagination that anything could ever be different. But deep in the consciousness of a suffering people, something was stirring. The weight had become too much. The years had grown too long. The silence was about to break. Chapter 3. The Cry That Changes Everything. The 15th year of oppression likely felt much like the 14th, the 17th much like the 16th. But somewhere in the 18th year something shifted. The biblical text offers no details about what triggered this shift. It simply states that the Israelites cried out to the Lord, but that simple statement contains profound theological weight. The cry represents a turning point, an acknowledgement that they cannot save themselves, a return to the covenant relationship they had abandoned. This was not a casual prayer. The Hebrew word used suggests intensity, desperation, a cry from the depths of anguish. This was the sound of a people at the end of their endurance, finally admitting they needed help beyond their own resources. We can imagine how this collective repentance might have emerged. Perhaps it began in individual households. A father praying over his starving children, a mother weeping over a tribute payment she could not afford, an elderly man remembering the days before Eglon and wondering if those days would ever return. These individual prayers would have joined together, in village gatherings, in whispered conversations at wells and marketplaces, in the shared recognition that they had strayed from God and that their suffering was connected to that straying. Repentance in the world of Judges is never portrayed as purely emotional. It involves acknowledgement of wrongdoing, return to covenant faithfulness, and trust that God will act. The Israelites were not simply asking to be rescued. They were returning to the relationship they had violated, and God responded. But the response did not come in the way anyone might have expected. No angelic army appeared in the sky. No plague struck down the Moabites. No miraculous military victory suddenly materialized. Instead, God began preparing a deliverer, a man who was, by all conventional measures, entirely unremarkable. Chapter 4. The Man Nobody Noticed. Ehud, son of Gera, came from the tribe of Benjamin. This detail matters more than it might initially appear. Benjamin was the smallest of the 12 tribes of Israel, descended from Jacob's youngest son. Their tribal territory was modest, wedged between the powerful tribes of Ephraim and Judah. They were not known for producing great leaders. They were not a military powerhouse. They were, in most respects, easy to overlook. Even Ehud's name carries a certain ordinariness. It means united, or where is the glory, depending on the interpretation. Nothing about it suggests destiny or greatness. He was not born into a family of judges or warriors. No biblical text suggests he showed early signs of extraordinary ability. But there was one unusual detail about Ehud that the biblical text specifically mentions. He was left-handed. In Hebrew, the phrase used is actually more nuanced. It literally reads, restricted in his right hand, which could mean either left-handed or ambidextrous with a preference for the left. Either way, this was notable in ancient Near Eastern culture. The majority of people are right-handed. Weapons training, combat techniques, and even architecture were designed around this assumption. Swords hung on the left hip for right-handed draw. Guards searched the left side of visitors where weapons would typically be concealed. Fighting stances anticipated right-handed attacks. A left-handed fighter disrupted all these assumptions. Their attacks came from unexpected angles. Their defensive patterns differed from what opponents trained against. In close combat, this could provide a significant advantage. The tribe of Benjamin actually became known for producing left-handed warriors. Another passage in Judges mentions 700 chosen Benjaminite soldiers who were left-handed and could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. This suggests left-handedness may have run in certain Benjaminite families, or that the tribe specifically trained left-handed fighters to exploit this tactical advantage. But Ehud was not primarily known as a warrior. When the time came to send the annual tribute to King Eglon, Ehud was selected as part of the delegation. This suggests he held some position of trust or responsibility within his community, but not necessarily a military one. Perhaps he was a civil administrator. Perhaps he had experience with logistics and inventory. Perhaps he simply seemed like someone who could be trusted to deliver valuable goods without stealing them. Whatever the reason, Ehud was chosen, and in that choice, God's plan began to take shape. Chapter 5. The Weapon. Nobody expected. Preparing the annual tribute to King Eglon would have been a major undertaking. Wagons had to be loaded with grain, oil, wine, and livestock. Accounts had to be settled, determining exactly how much each Israelite community owed. Guards had to be assigned to protect the valuable cargo on its journey to Jericho. Ehud participated in all of this preparation, but he was also preparing something else. He commissioned a dagger. The biblical text specifies it was a cubit in length, approximately 18 inches from tip to hilt. This was longer than a typical dagger, but shorter than a sword. The text also emphasizes that it was double-edged, designed to cut in both directions, to maximize damage whether thrust in or pulled out. This was not a decorative weapon. This was a killing tool, carefully crafted for a very specific purpose. Ehud concealed this weapon under his clothing, strapped to his right thigh. This detail is crucial to understanding his plan. Guards searching visitors for weapons would check the left side of the body, where right-handed people would carry a sword or dagger for easy draw. The right thigh was the wrong side, the unexpected side, the side that would be overlooked. For a left-handed man, however, the right thigh was the perfect position. Ehud could draw across his body with his left hand in a smooth, natural motion. The weapon's placement turned his left-handedness from a minor oddity into a strategic advantage. This level of planning reveals something important about Ehud's character. He was not acting on impulse or passion. He was not simply seizing a moment of opportunity. He had thought this through. He had identified vulnerabilities in Eglon's security. He had designed a weapon specifically suited to his plan. He had positioned it where it would not be discovered. We do not know when Ehud conceived this plan. Perhaps during the long months of preparation for the tribute delivery. Perhaps years earlier, waiting for the right opportunity. Perhaps only recently, after the people cried out to God and he felt called to act. What we do know is that as the tribute caravan prepared to depart for Jericho, Ehud carried more than grain and livestock. He carried a blade and a plan that would change everything. Chapter 6. The Journey to Jericho. The route from Benjaminite territory to Jericho would have taken the tribute caravan through rugged terrain descending toward the Jordan Valley. This was not an easy journey. Wagons had to navigate steep inclines and rocky paths. The heat of the valley, hundreds of feet below sea level, would have been oppressive, especially in summer months. Ehud had time to think during this journey, time to review his plan, time to consider what he was about to do, time to feel the weight of the concealed dagger against his thigh. What goes through a man's mind when he knows he is travelling toward an assassination? Fear, certainly. The plan had many points where it could fail. Discovery at the security checkpoint, interruption during the private audience, failure to escape afterward. Any of these failures would mean not just his own death, but likely brutal reprisals against his family and community. But fear was not the only emotion Ehud must have carried. There was also purpose. For 18 years his people had suffered. For 18 years they had paid tribute to a foreign king. For 18 years they had lived diminished lives under Moabite domination. If this plan succeeded, that could end. The theological framework of the story suggests Ehud understood himself as acting not merely from personal initiative, but as an instrument of divine deliverance. The later biblical text attributes the victory to God working through Ehud, not to Ehud's cleverness alone. Whether Ehud felt divine calling, sensed God's guidance, or simply recognized an opportunity and chose to act, his mission carried spiritual weight beyond mere political assassination. As Jericho came into view across the valley floor, Ehud would have seen the city walls rising from the plain. Somewhere within those walls sat King Eglon in his cool upper chamber, expecting nothing more than another routine tribute delivery. Another group of defeated Israelites bringing the wealth of their land to fill his treasury. He had no idea that this year would be different, that this particular delivery would be his last. Chapter 7. The Palace Security Protocol. Entering King Eglon's palace required passing through multiple layers of security. This was standard practice for ancient Near Eastern rulers, especially those governing conquered territories where assassination was always a risk. The tribute caravan would have been stopped at the outer gates. Guards would have inventoried the goods, checking them against expected quantities. Weapons would have been strictly prohibited beyond this point. Each member of the delegation would have been searched. This is where Ehud's concealed dagger faced its first test. The guards checked the left side of his body. They found nothing. The right side, where a left-handed man might actually conceal a weapon, went unexamined. It was the wrong side. The side that made no sense to check. The dagger remained hidden. Once cleared through security, the delegation would have been escorted into the palace compound. Moabite architecture of this period favoured open courtyards surrounded by rooms, designed to maximise airflow and shade in the intense heat of the Jordan Valley. The king's audience chamber would have been located in an upper story, where breezes could circulate and provide relief from the temperature below. The tribute delivery itself would have been a formal ceremony. The goods were presented, inspected and acknowledged. Eglon would have received the delegation with the practiced detachment of a ruler who had watched this same scene repeat annually for 18 years. The Israelites bowed. They offered their tribute. They spoke the required formulas of submission. Ehud participated in all of this. He played his role perfectly. Just another tribute bearer. Just another defeated Israelite acknowledging Moabite supremacy. The ceremony concluded. The tribute was accepted, the delegation was dismissed, and here Ehud made his move. Chapter 8. The Secret Message. After the formal presentation ended, Ehud accompanied the other tribute bearers as they began their journey home. They left the palace, they passed through Jericho, they travelled some distance toward Israelite territory. Then, at a place called the Stone Quarries near Gilgal, Ehud stopped. He sent the others ahead. He turned back toward Jericho alone. Why did he do this? The most practical reason is deniability and witness reduction. If the assassination succeeded and Ehud managed to escape, the other tribute bearers could honestly claim they had left before anything happened. They knew nothing of his plan. They were simply following his instructions to continue home while he returned for some additional business with the king. This also meant fewer potential obstacles during the escape. Ehud would not have to coordinate with or protect other members of the delegation. He could move quickly and independently. But returning alone also increased his personal risk dramatically. He would have no backup, no one to create distractions or help if things went wrong. Everything depended on the success of his deception and the effectiveness of his strike. Ehud approached the palace again. This time he was not part of a formal delegation. He was a single man requesting an audience. The guards recognised him from the earlier tribute delivery. He had just been cleared through security hours before. He was not carrying the tribute goods anymore, so there was no obvious reason to search him again. He told them he had a secret message for the king, a private communication that could only be delivered personally. The appeal to secrecy was brilliant psychology. Kings are always interested in secret information. Intelligence about rivals, confidential reports, private messages that cannot be delivered through normal channels. The suggestion that Ehud carried such information would have intrigued Eglon, especially coming from someone who had just left and returned unexpectedly. The guards brought Ehud's request to the king. Eglon, comfortable in his cool upper chamber, agreed to see him. Ehud was escorted into the presence of the man he had come to kill. Chapter 9. The Cool Upper Room. The biblical text tells us that Eglon was sitting alone in his cool upper room. The Hebrew word used suggests a room designed specifically for relief from heat, possibly with latticed windows to catch breezes from multiple directions. This was the king's private space, a retreat from the formality of the throne room and the oppressive temperature of the valley. Eglon received Ehud in this intimate setting. The servants and guards withdrew, providing the privacy appropriate for receiving a secret message. The doors closed. 2 men, 1 room. A conversation that would last only moments. Ehud approached the seated king. He said, "I have a message from God for you." The phrase is theologically loaded. Ehud was not claiming to bring a message from Moabite deities. He said God in a way that would have been understood as referring to the God of Israel. This was, in its own way, perfectly true. What was about to happen was a message from God, though not the kind Eglon expected. The text tells us that Eglon rose from his seat when he heard this. Whether this was a gesture of respect or divine communication, or simply his natural reaction to stand when receiving an important message, we cannot know. But the movement was crucial. It positioned him perfectly for what came next. Ehud reached with his left hand to his right thigh. His fingers closed around the hilt of the concealed dagger. In one smooth motion, he drew the blade and drove it into Eglon's belly. The biblical description is remarkably graphic. The text specifies that the blade went in so deep that the hilt followed the tip, and that fat closed over the blade. This detail, visceral as it is, serves a narrative purpose. It emphasizes that Eglon was an obese man, and it explains why Ehud left the weapon in place rather than withdrawing it. The blade was buried too deeply, held too firmly by the king's flesh. Ehud did not attempt to remove it. He left the dagger where it was and moved toward the exit. Chapter 10. The Locked Door, Deception. After striking down King Eglon, Ehud faced a critical problem: escape. The king lay dying or dead in the upper chamber. Guards waited outside. The palace was full of Moabite soldiers. Discovery at this point would mean immediate death. Ehud's solution was elegant and simple. He went out through the porch of the upper room and closed and locked the doors behind him. Then he walked away. The locked doors served multiple purposes. First, they gave the appearance of normalcy. Kings often locked themselves in private chambers when they wanted to rest undisturbed or conduct confidential business. Guards were trained to respect this privacy. A locked door meant do not disturb. Second, the locked doors bought time. Even when the guards eventually realized something was wrong, they would have to break down the doors to enter. That delay, even if only minutes, could be the difference between Ehud reaching safety or being caught. The biblical text includes a darkly humorous detail about what happened next. The servants waited outside the locked doors. Time passed. The king did not emerge. Eventually they became concerned and checked the locks. Finding the doors secured from inside, they assumed the king was relieving himself in the private chamber. This assumption extended Ehud's head start even further. The guards were not merely respectful of the king's privacy, they were embarrassed to disturb him during an intimate bodily function. So they waited, and waited, and waited. By the time they finally overcame their reluctance and broke down the doors, Eglon was dead on the floor, and Ehud was long gone. Chapter 11. The Escape Route. Ehud's escape from Jericho required more than just leaving the palace. The entire city was effectively a Moabite military installation. Guards at gates, soldiers on patrol, officials who might recognize him from the tribute delegation. The text does not specify his exact route, but it tells us he passed the stone quarries and escaped to Syra. This suggests he headed into the hill country, moving toward the rugged terrain that would make pursuit more difficult. The stone quarries near Gilgal may have provided cover for this initial phase of escape. Quarry sites were industrial areas with workers, equipment, and rough terrain. A man moving through such an area would attract less attention than one running through open country. Once into the hills, Ehud had geographical advantages. He knew this terrain. He had local knowledge of paths, water sources, and settlements. The Moabite forces pursuing him would lack these advantages, but Ehud was not simply fleeing. He had a destination in mind and a purpose beyond mere survival. He was heading toward the hill country of Ephraim, to a specific location where he could rally Israelite forces. Because killing King Eglon was only the first phase of the plan. Assassination without follow-through would merely result in a new Moabite king and brutal reprisals. Ehud needed to transform this act of individual violence into a moment of national uprising. He needed to turn an assassination into a revolution. Chapter 12. The Sound of the Ram's Horn. When Ehud reached the hill country of Ephraim, he did something that would have carried enormous psychological weight. He sounded a trumpet. The ram's horn, or shofar, was not merely a musical instrument in ancient Israel. It was a call to assembly, to war, to divine action. It was the sound that had preceded the fall of Jericho under Joshua. It was the sound that announced sacred festivals. It was the sound of alarm and the sound of victory. When that sound echoed through the hills, people responded. Men emerged from their homes and fields. They gathered to hear what message accompanied this urgent call. Ehud's message was simple and electrifying. Follow me, for the Lord has given your enemies the Moabites into your hands. Notice the theological framing. Ehud did not claim credit for himself. He did not say, I have killed King Eglon. He said the Lord has given the Moabites into your hands. This was divine deliverance working through human agency. The response suggests careful preparation. Ehud did not randomly sound a trumpet and hope people would follow. He knew where to go. He knew who would respond. He had likely spent months or even years building relationships, identifying potential fighters, laying groundwork for this moment. The men who rallied to him were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and shepherds, craftsmen and merchants. They had lived under Moabite oppression for 18 years. Many had never fought in battle, but they came anyway. They came because Eglon was dead. They came because the Moabite administrative structure had been decapitated. They came because for the first time in 18 years victory seemed possible, and they came because Ehud led them. Chapter 13. The Strategic Seizure. Ehud did not lead his hastily assembled force directly to Jericho. That would have been militarily foolish. Jericho remained a fortified city with Moabite garrison forces. A frontal assault by untrained Israelites would have been suicidal. Instead, Ehud pursued a strategic objective that would cut off Moabite reinforcement and escape routes, the fords of the Jordan River. The Jordan was the natural barrier between Moab's homeland east of the river and their occupied territory west of it. Crossing the Jordan was only practical at specific shallow points called fords. Control these fords, and you controlled movement between Moab and the occupied zone. Ehud's forces moved quickly to seize these crossing points. They positioned themselves to intercept any Moabite soldiers trying to flee back to their homeland, or any reinforcements trying to reach Jericho from the east. This manoeuvre displayed considerable tactical awareness. Ehud understood that the death of Eglon had created a temporary window of confusion and disorganization among Moabite forces. But that window would not last long. Eventually word would reach Moabite commanders east of the Jordan. Eventually they would organize a response. Eventually they would attempt either to flee or to reinforce. By seizing the fords first, Ehud ensured that neither option was available. The Moabites in the occupied territory were isolated, trapped between the Jordan they could not cross, and the Israelite uprising now mobilizing against them. Chapter 14. The Battle at the Fords. When Moabite forces attempted to retreat across the Jordan, they found the fords blocked by Israelite fighters. What followed was not a set-piece battle between organised armies. It was a desperate struggle at river crossing points, with Moabites trying to break through and Israelites determined to hold them back. The biblical text records the outcome with stark simplicity. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong men. Not a man escaped. 10,000 is a significant number, though whether it should be taken as precisely accurate or as a general indication of a substantial force is debated by scholars. Either way, it represents a decisive military victory. The Moabite occupation force was effectively destroyed. The detail that not a man escaped emphasizes the completeness of the Israelite victory. Control of the fords meant the Moabites had nowhere to run. They could not retreat to their homeland. They could not disperse into the countryside and regroup. They were trapped and defeated in detail. This level of victory would not have been possible without several factors aligning. The assassination had decapitated the command structure. The quick seizure of the fords had isolated the occupation force. The uprising had mobilized before Moabite commanders could respond effectively. And the Israelite fighters, untrained as they were, fought with the desperation of people who knew this was their one chance at freedom. The theological interpretation embedded in the text attributes all of this to divine intervention. God had strengthened Eglon to oppress Israel as judgment. Now God was using Ehud to deliver Israel in response to their repentance. The victory was not merely the result of clever tactics. It was the Lord giving the Moabites into Israel's hands. Chapter 15. The collapse of an occupation. The destruction of the Moabite occupation force at the Jordan fords did not immediately end all Moabite presence in the region, but it broke the back of their control. Without King Eglon, without their main military force, without secure lines of communication to their homeland, the remaining Moabite officials and soldiers found their position untenable. Some likely fled individually, abandoning their posts and attempting to reach Moab however they could. Others may have surrendered or sought asylum with local populations. The biblical text does not detail their fate, focusing instead on the larger narrative of Israel's deliverance. What is clear is that the administrative apparatus of occupation collapsed. The tribute collection system ended. The Moabite officials who had governed Israelite settlements disappeared. The soldiers who had patrolled the roads withdrew or were killed. For the first time in 18 years, Israelites did not have to pay tribute. They did not have to submit to foreign governors. They did not have to watch their wealth flow toward Jericho. The psychological impact of this liberation would have been profound. People who had never known freedom as adults experienced it for the first time. Families that had planned their lives around tribute obligations suddenly had resources for their own use. Communities that had existed under constant surveillance could gather and worship without restriction. But liberation also brings challenges. The power structures that had governed daily life for nearly 2 decades were gone. New systems had to emerge. Questions of leadership, resource distribution, and security had to be addressed. In many liberation movements throughout history, this transition period proves chaotic and sometimes violent. Different factions compete for power. Old scores are settled. The absence of the oppressor creates a vacuum that various groups rush to fill. The biblical text, however, indicates a remarkably smooth transition. And the reason for that smooth transition was the length of the peace that followed. Chapter 16. 80 years of rest. After the defeat of Moab, the text tells us, the land had rest for 80 years. This is one of the longest periods of peace recorded in the book of Judges. Only the 40 years of rest after Gideon's victory approaches this duration. 80 years is more than a lifetime. It represents 3 or 4 generations. Children born after the victory would live their entire lives, grow old, and die without experiencing foreign occupation. Their children would have children who would grow to adulthood in peace. This extended peace suggests that the victory over Moab was decisive enough to establish stable conditions. Moab did not attempt to reconquer the territory. No other neighbouring power moved in to fill the vacuum. Israel maintained enough cohesion and strength to deter external threats. But the text attributes this peace not merely to military victory or strategic positioning. It attributes it to the rest God gave the land after deliverance. The peace was part of the pattern established throughout Judges. Oppression leading to repentance, leading to deliverance, leading to rest. What happened during those 80 years? The biblical text provides no details, no stories of heroic deeds or dramatic events, just rest. And perhaps that is precisely the point. Peace is often historically invisible. Historians focus on wars, revolutions, upheavals. The quiet years when farmers tend their fields, when children grow up safely, when communities thrive without drama. These years leave few records. They produce no dramatic narratives. But they are the goal. All the struggle, all the sacrifice, all the violence, it all aims toward these quiet years. The 80 years when Israel could simply exist without oppression. Of course, the pattern of Judges suggests this peace did not last forever. The book of Judges continues with more cycles of disobedience, oppression, and deliverance. The 80 years eventually ended. New challenges emerged. The next generation forgot the lessons their ancestors learned. But for those 80 years, the people rested. And that rest was purchased by a left-handed man with a concealed dagger and the courage to use it. Chapter 17. The theological questions that remain. The story of Ehud raises uncomfortable questions that have troubled interpreters for centuries. At its core, this is a story about assassination as an instrument of divine deliverance. A man conceals a weapon, gains private access to a king through deception, kills him, and this act is presented as divinely sanctioned liberation. How should we understand this theologically? The ancient Israelite perspective viewed Ehud as a hero, a judge raised up by God to deliver his people. The inclusion of this story in Scripture, its preservation and transmission across millennia, suggests it was understood as a righteous act within its context. But modern readers, operating from different ethical frameworks, often find the violence disturbing. Assassination, deception, and targeted killing raise moral questions that do not have simple answers. Some interpreters emphasize the unique historical context. Israel was an oppressed nation without conventional military means to resist. Eglon was not merely a foreign king, but an oppressor whose rule caused genuine suffering. The assassination was not personal revenge, but an act of resistance against tyranny. Others point to the pattern of divine judgment and deliverance throughout Judges. Eglon's rule was itself presented as divine judgment on Israel's disobedience. Ehud's action was the divinely appointed means of ending that judgment when the people repented. The violence, while real, served redemptive purposes within God's larger plan for his people. Still others struggle with the idea of God using violence at all, seeing tension between the God of judges who strengthens oppressors and raises up violent deliverers, and the God revealed in Jesus who teaches enemy love and non-violent resistance. These tensions cannot be easily resolved. Scripture itself does not offer simple explanations. It presents the story, attributes Ehud's success to God's action, records the 80 years of peace that followed, and moves on to the next cycle. Perhaps the discomfort we feel when reading the story is appropriate. Perhaps we are meant to wrestle with questions about violence and deliverance, justice and revenge, divine sovereignty, and human agency. Chapter 18. The Pattern of Unlikely Deliverers. One consistent theme throughout the Book of Judges is God's choice of unexpected deliverers. Ehud was left-handed from the smallest tribe. Deborah was a woman in a patriarchal society. Gideon was the weakest member of the weakest clan. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, rejected by his family. Samson was undisciplined and motivated more by personal vengeance than national deliverance. None of these judges fit the profile of ideal leaders. None came from positions of power or privilege. None seemed destined for greatness based on conventional measures. This pattern appears to be deliberate. The theology of Judges repeatedly emphasizes that deliverance comes from God, not from human strength or wisdom. By choosing unlikely deliverers, the text underscores that the victories belong to God rather than to naturally gifted human leaders. Ehud exemplifies this pattern. His left-handedness, a minor physical detail, becomes the key to his success. His lack of military background does not disqualify him, because the victory does not depend on professional military skill. His tribal origin from Benjamin, far from being a disadvantage, positions him perfectly to act when the opportunity arises. This theme resonates throughout biblical literature. God chooses the younger son over the elder, the small nation over the empire, the shepherd over the warrior, the virgin over the powerful, the unexpected over the obvious. The theological point is clear. God's power is demonstrated most clearly when human resources are inadequate, when success obviously could not have come from natural advantages or human strength alone. For the original audience of Judges, living in circumstances of weakness and vulnerability, this would have been an enormously encouraging message. They did not need to be strong, wealthy, numerous, or naturally gifted. They needed to be faithful. They needed to respond when called. They needed to trust that God could work through their limitations. The same message speaks to circumstances of powerlessness in any era, when conventional resources are lacking, when the odds seem impossible, when deliverance appears unlikely. The story of Ehud says, "Watch for the unexpected." God often works through the overlooked, the unlikely, and the unusual. Chapter 19. The Legacy, written in silence. After the victory over Moab and the establishment of peace, Ehud disappears from the biblical narrative. We are told nothing about the remaining years of his life. We do not know if he served as a formal leader during the 80 years of peace. We do not know how he died or where he was buried. This silence is itself significant. Ehud's importance lies entirely in the deliverance he accomplished, not in his personal story or ongoing leadership. The text is not interested in his biography. It is interested in what God accomplished through him. This stands in contrast to many ancient Near Eastern victory accounts. Kings and military leaders typically commissioned detailed records of their achievements. They built monuments inscribed with their victories. They ensured their names would be remembered through elaborate memorials. Ehud gets 11 verses, a brief account of oppression, deliverance, and rest. His name survives only because it was attached to this moment of national liberation. In some ways, this makes the story more powerful. Ehud was not seeking glory or historical remembrance. He was responding to a crisis. He did what needed to be done. The 80 years of peace that followed were his legacy, more than any monument could be. This also reflects the communal nature of the deliverance. While Ehud struck the initial blow against Eglon, the full liberation required the Israelites who rallied to his trumpet call. It required the men who seized the Jordan fords. It required the fighters who defeated the Moabite forces. Ehud was the catalyst, but deliverance was a collective achievement. The silence about Ehud's later life also prevents the story from becoming about personal heroism rather than divine action. We cannot turn Ehud into a cult of personality because we know almost nothing about his personality. We cannot focus on his natural abilities because the text does not describe them. We are left with the basic facts. God raised up a deliverer, the oppression ended, peace followed. Chapter 20. The Memory that Shapes. Future. Hope. The story of Ehud would have been transmitted orally for generations before being written down. Parents told it to children. Elders recounted it in gatherings. The details, shaped by countless retellings, eventually took the literary form we find in Judges chapter 3. Each generation that heard this story would have understood it through their own circumstances. During peaceful times, it served as a reminder of past dangers and God's faithfulness in delivering from them. During times of oppression, it became a source of hope that deliverance was possible even from seemingly impossible situations. The story would have carried particular power for communities experiencing foreign domination. Knowing that their ancestors had once been freed from 18 years of Moabite rule would have suggested that current oppression, however severe, was not the final word. God had delivered before. God could deliver again. The specifics of Ehud's method, the concealed weapon and the assassination, would have resonated with people who understood the dynamics of asymmetric resistance. When conventional military options are unavailable, unconventional methods become necessary. When open confrontation is impossible, strategic deception becomes a tool of liberation. But the story also contained a warning embedded in the larger pattern of Judges. The deliverance Ehud accomplished, dramatic as it was, did not permanently solve Israel's problems. The 80 years of peace eventually ended. New cycles of disobedience and oppression followed. Freedom required ongoing faithfulness, not just a single dramatic act of deliverance. This meant that hearing the story of Ehud should provoke both encouragement and examination. Encouragement that God delivers his people. Examination about whether they were maintaining the covenant faithfulness that made such deliverance possible. Chapter 21. The Archaeological Silence. Unlike some biblical narratives, the story of Ehud leaves little archaeological footprint. We have no Moabite records confirming King Eglon's existence or describing his conquest of Israelite territory. We have no inscriptions commemorating the battle at the Jordan fords. We have no physical evidence of the tribute system or the occupation administration. This silence does not mean the events did not occur. Ancient records are fragmentary, especially from this period. Many historical events that certainly happened left no archaeological trace. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What archaeology does confirm is the general context in which these events would have occurred. We know that the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in the Levant were periods of frequent conflict between small kingdoms and city-states. We know that Moab existed as a kingdom east of the Dead Sea. We know that Jericho was occupied during this period. We know that tribute systems and occupation administrations were common features of ancient Near Eastern political relationships. The specific details about Ehud, however, remain in the realm of tradition and text rather than material evidence. This places interpreters in the position of deciding how to evaluate the historical reliability of the account based on internal literary features, consistency with known historical patterns, and theological considerations. Some scholars treat the story as essentially legendary, a national foundation myth with minimal historical basis. Others argue for a historical core that was later embellished with theological interpretation. Still others accept the account as substantially historical, allowing for the conventions of ancient historical writing, which differed significantly from modern standards. These debates cannot be definitively resolved with current evidence. What remains undebatable is that the story of Ehud shaped Israelite and later Jewish and Christian understanding of divine deliverance, unexpected heroism, and the cycles of faithfulness and unfaithfulness that characterize their relationship with God. Chapter 22. The Moral Complexity of Liberation. Every liberation narrative involves moral complexity. The oppressed rarely gain freedom without cost. The oppressor rarely surrenders power peacefully. The transition from subjugation to independence involves violence more often than we might wish. Ehud's story does not shy away from this reality. The text presents the assassination of Eglon in graphic detail. It does not sanitize the violence. It does not pretend that freedom came without bloodshed. This unflinching presentation invites reflection on the ethics of resistance. When is violence justified in pursuit of liberation? What methods are acceptable when confronting oppression? Where are the moral boundaries, if any, in asymmetric conflict? Different ethical frameworks produce different answers to these questions. Pacifist traditions emphasize the primacy of non-violence even in the face of oppression, arguing that the means cannot be separated from the ends. Just war traditions attempt to establish criteria for when and how violence may be ethically employed. Liberation theology often emphasizes the structural violence of oppressive systems and validates resistance, including armed resistance by the oppressed. The biblical text does not explicitly engage these philosophical frameworks. It presents Ehud's action as divinely sanctioned deliverance without extensive moral qualification. This has led interpreters across centuries to project their own ethical conclusions onto the text. What the text does emphasize is consequence. Ehud's action led to freedom. The assassination of one oppressive king resulted in liberty for an entire nation. The 80 years of peace that followed justified, within the narrative logic, the violence that preceded them. This utilitarian calculus, evaluating actions by their consequences rather than their intrinsic moral quality, troubles some readers. It seems to suggest that ends justify means, that outcomes matter more than methods, but perhaps the text is simply being honest about the nature of historical change. Oppressive systems rarely dissolve peacefully. Those who benefit from injustice rarely surrender their advantages without resistance. Liberation, throughout history, has consistently required more than moral persuasion. Ehud's story reminds us that freedom often has a price measured in blood. Chapter 23. The question of divine command. Central to the moral evaluation of Ehud's action is the question of divine command. The text presents Ehud as a judge raised up by God to deliver Israel. His action, while violent, operates within a theological framework where God initiates deliverance in response to the people's repentance. This raises profound questions about the relationship between divine command and moral action. If God commands or sanctions something, does that make it morally right? Can actions that would otherwise be wrong become right when divinely commanded? Finally, the philosophical problem of divine command ethics has occupied theologians for millennia. The Euthyphro dilemma, articulated by Plato, asks whether things are good because God commands them, or whether God commands them because they are good. Is morality independent of God's will, or is it constituted by God's commands? Applied to Ehud's story, this question becomes concrete. Was assassinating Eglon right because God raised up Ehud to do it? Or did God raise up Ehud because assassinating Eglon was the right thing to do given the circumstances? Different theological traditions answer differently. Divine command theory argues that God's commands define moral obligation. An action becomes right when God commands it, regardless of its inherent qualities. Natural law approaches suggest that God commands what is intrinsically good, making divine commands align with moral truth rather than creating it. The biblical text itself does not philosophize about these questions. It operates from an assumed theological framework where God's sovereignty over history is taken for granted. Within that framework, Ehud's action is validated by its divine appointment and its liberating consequences. For modern readers trying to apply this story, the question becomes whether similar violence could be justified today by claiming divine sanction. History is full of examples of people committing terrible acts while claiming to do God's will. How do we distinguish genuine divine calling from self-serving religious justification? The story of Ehud does not provide easy answers to these questions. It stands as a witness to a particular historical moment understood through a particular theological lens. How we apply its lessons to contemporary situations requires wrestling with both the text and our own contexts. Chapter 24, The 80 Silent Years. Let us return to those 80 years of peace. The text gives them only a single sentence, but they represent the entire point of Ehud's violent action. They are what the assassination purchased. They are the outcome that validates everything that came before. Imagine being alive during those years. You were born after the Moabite occupation ended. You grew up hearing stories about the tribute payments and the oppression, but you never experienced them yourself. Your parents talk about King Eglon and the day Ehud sounded the trumpet, but these are historical events to you, not living memories. You plant your fields without fear that foreign soldiers will confiscate your harvest. You raise your family without worrying about tribute obligations. You worship God without restriction or surveillance. Life is not perfect, but it is peaceful. You have what your parents' generation fought for, freedom to live without oppression. This is what peace looks like, not dramatic, not historically notable, just ordinary life proceeding generation after generation without catastrophic interruption. The farmers who planted and harvested year after year during those 80 years were not heroes. The shepherds who tended their flocks were not remembered in songs. The mothers who raised children who grew up and had children of their own left no monuments. But they lived the lives that the judges fought to make possible. This perspective reframes our understanding of biblical heroism. Ehud's moment of violent action lasted minutes. The piece's action enabled lasted 80 years. Which mattered more? From one angle, the assassination was the critical moment. Without it, the peace could not have happened. Ehud's courage and the subsequent military victory created the conditions for everything that followed. From another angle, the peace was the point. The assassination was merely a means to an end. What mattered was not the dramatic moment of liberation, but the quiet decades of freedom that followed. Perhaps we need both perspectives. The dramatic action of deliverance and the sustained reality of peace form a complete picture. Ehud matters because his action led to 80 years of rest. The 80 years of rest matter because they represent the fulfillment of what deliverance aims to achieve. Epilogue. The pattern continues. The story of Ehud does not exist in isolation. It is one episode in the larger narrative of Judges, which chronicles a repeated cycle across several generations. Disobedience leads to oppression. Oppression leads to repentance. Repentance leads to deliverance. Deliverance leads to peace. Peace leads eventually back to disobedience. Understanding Ehud's story requires understanding this larger pattern. The 80 years of peace he helped establish eventually ended. The next generation, or the generation after that, drifted away from covenant faithfulness. New oppression followed. New judges arose to deliver. The cycle continued. This repetition might seem discouraging. Why does Israel keep failing? Why does each generation have to relearn the same lessons? Why doesn't deliverance produce lasting transformation? But perhaps the repetition itself contains a message. Human communities are not perfectible. Each generation faces the same fundamental choices about faithfulness and identity. Each generation must decide whether to maintain covenant relationship with God or drift into cultural accommodation and religious syncretism. The judges are not meant to be perfect heroes who solve all problems permanently. They are meant to be instruments of divine grace in particular moments of crisis. They address immediate situations of oppression. They create space for renewal and rest. But they cannot make the next generation's choices for them. This means that Ehud's legacy is not the permanent elimination of Israel's problems. It is the demonstration that when people cry out to God in genuine repentance, deliverance comes, even from situations that seem hopeless, even through the most unlikely people. That message transcends the specific details of Moabite oppression and Jordan River battles. It speaks to the recurring human need for hope in the face of overwhelming circumstances. It reminds us that history is not inevitable, that oppression can end, that freedom is possible. Closing reflection. The blade that freed a nation. We began this story asking how deliverance comes when oppression feels permanent. We have traced the answer through 18 years of tribute, through the forging of a concealed dagger, through the assassination of a king, through the rallying cry of a trumpet, through the seizure of river fords, through the defeat of an occupation force, and through 80 years of peace. The answer is complex. Deliverance came through divine response to human repentance. It came through the courage of one man willing to risk everything, It came through careful planning and strategic execution. It came through collective action and military victory. It came through the grace that allows broken communities to experience restoration. But above all, according to the theological framework of the text, deliverance came because God had not abandoned his people. Their oppression was judgment, but judgment was not the final word. When they turned back to him, he raised up a deliverer. That deliverer was not who anyone would have expected. Not a military commander, not a powerful leader, not someone from a prominent tribe. Just Ehud, the left-handed Benjaminite who knew where to hide a blade and when to use it. His story survives because it mattered, because the freedom it created shaped generations, because the pattern it exemplified, God working through unlikely people to accomplish unexpected deliverance, resonated across centuries. We do not know what happened to Ehud after the victory. We do not know if he lived to see the full 80 years of peace, or died shortly after the battle. We do not know how he processed the act of violence he committed, or how it shaped the rest of his life. What we know is that when he was needed, he acted. When the moment came, he was ready. When deliverance required someone to carry a hidden blade into a king's chamber, Ehud was willing to do it. And for 80 years his people rested. The farmers planted their fields, the shepherds tended their flocks, the children grew up free, the elderly died in peace. This was the freedom purchased by a left-handed man and an 18-inch blade. This was the deliverance that came when one person answered the call. This was the moment when oppression, no matter how permanent it seemed, finally ended. Settle in. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders, from your chest, from your hands. Tonight, we're going to walk the dusty streets of ancient Jericho together, and by the end, I think something quiet and true might find you too. Jericho was one of the oldest cities in the world. Even at the time this story takes place, it had already been standing for thousands of years. It sat in the warm, low valley of the Jordan River, sheltered below the surrounding hills and blessed by natural springs that gave the region its lush, almost dreamlike quality. The Romans called it a paradise. Traders moved through it constantly. It was a crossroads city, the kind of place where people came from every direction and every walk of life, brushed shoulders for a moment, and then moved on. On this particular day, the streets of Jericho were louder than usual. Word had travelled ahead of itself the way it always did in those years, passing from mouth to ear to mouth again until it moved faster than any cart or horse. The word was this: Jesus of Nazareth was coming through. And that name by this point was not simply a name, it carried weight, it carried stories, healings in Galilee, a blind man given sight near this very road, a dead girl raised in the home of a synagogue leader, a sinful woman forgiven at a Pharisee's dinner table. The stories were everywhere, and they had changed the way people moved through their days, with a kind of leaning forward anticipation, a hope that something impossible might yet be possible. The crowds that gathered along the road into Jericho were enormous. People stood 3 and 4 deep on either side of the narrow streets, pressing against one another, craning their necks, lifting children onto their shoulders. The air was thick with the smell of dust and cooking fires, and the faint sweetness of the sycamore trees that lined certain parts of the road. The sound was constant, voices layering over voices, the shuffling of sandals on stone, the occasional cry of a child, the low murmur of people sharing what little they knew and filling in the rest with hope. Among those gathered, pressed into the edges of the crowd, was a man named Zacchaeus. He was trying to see, and he could not. To understand Zacchaeus fully, to understand why this story matters as deeply as it does, you have to understand exactly what kind of man he was and what that meant in the world he lived in. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, not simply a tax collector, but a chief one, meaning he oversaw others who collected on his behalf, which multiplied both his reach and his income. In 1st century Roman-occupied Judea, tax collectors operated within a system that was almost designed for corruption. The Roman government contracted tax collection out to private individuals who were expected to collect a certain minimum amount and were permitted to keep anything beyond that for themselves. The result was a class of men who had every financial incentive to overcharge and almost no accountability for doing so. Most tax collectors in that world did exactly what the system rewarded them for doing. They took more than was owed. They pressured people who could not pay. They lined their pockets while their neighbours went hungry. Zacchaeus was wealthy. The text does not hedge on this point. He was not doing moderately well. He was rich. And in that world, for a man in his position, that wealth came with an assumed moral cost that everyone around him understood perfectly. People did not simply distrust tax collectors. They despised them. They were considered traitors, Jews who had chosen to work for the occupying Roman Empire, to enforce the empire's financial demands on their own people, for personal profit. They were barred from certain civic and religious roles. They were socially quarantined. Parents warned children away from them. Respectable citizens crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries. And Zacchaeus, as a chief tax collector, as the man running the operation, not simply working within it, would have been regarded as the worst among a despised group. He had climbed higher in a profession that no one with good standing would enter. He had more money than most people in Jericho would see in a lifetime. He had power, and he had almost no one who actually wanted to be near him. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with that combination. It is not the loneliness of poverty, which at least carries with it community, shared hardship, shared tables, shared prayers. It is the loneliness of having constructed a life that keeps everyone at arm's length, and then arriving, somewhere in the quiet of an ordinary evening, at the realization that the arm's length was working, that no one was getting through, that the walls built to protect had also imprisoned. Zacchaeus was also short. The Gospel of Luke includes this detail plainly, without elaboration, as if it is simply a fact of the man's physical reality, and it was. But in the context of the crowd that day, that physical detail takes on a kind of poetic significance. He could not see over the people in front of him. The crowd that blocked his view was made up of the same people who had spent years blocking him from everything else: community, belonging, a place in the world that felt like it was genuinely his. He was rich. He was powerful. He was alone. He was small. And he desperately wanted to see the man everyone was talking about. What Zacchaeus did next is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the entire New Testament. Not because it was miraculous, not because it required divine power, but because of what it cost him in terms of dignity, and what that cost revealed about what was happening inside him. He ran ahead. Think about that for a moment. This was a man of wealth and position. A chief tax collector in a prosperous Roman city did not run through streets. Running was for children and servants. Running was undignified. Running in public, shoving through a crowd, hiking up your robes and sprinting ahead of everyone. That was the behaviour of someone who had forgotten himself, or who had, perhaps, finally decided that himself was not worth protecting. He ran ahead of the crowd, along the road he knew Jesus would travel, looking for a way to see, and he found one. There along the road stood a sycamore tree, a fig mulberry tree, broad-trunked and low-branched, the kind that invited climbing. The sycamore was common in that region, often planted along roads and pathways for their shade. Its branches began low enough that a determined adult could reach them, and Zacchaeus, without apparent hesitation, climbed one. This act deserves to be held in stillness for a moment. A chief tax collector, a man whose entire social standing, for whatever it was worth, rested on being perceived as above the ordinary, sat in a tree by the side of a road like a child trying to see a parade. He did not send a servant ahead to secure a better position. He did not use his wealth to arrange access. He did not ask anyone for help, because asking would have required someone who was willing to help him, and that was not a population that existed in great numbers. He just climbed, alone, in public, with the full knowledge that anyone who looked his way would see exactly what they were seeing, and would think exactly what they were already thinking about him. And he did not care, or perhaps more accurately, whatever he cared about in that moment was larger than whatever it cost him to care about it. That is worth noticing. The desire to see Jesus was strong enough to override the self-protective instincts of a man who had spent years constructing walls. Something had cracked open. Something was pulling at him from a direction he had not expected. He did not have words for it yet. He may not have had words for it ever, but he was in a tree, and the crowd was coming, and he was waiting. There is something in that image. The small, wealthy, despised man sitting alone in the branches of a sycamore tree watching the road, that feels almost unbearably human. We have all been in some version of that tree. We have all found ourselves in a position we could not quite explain, reaching for something we could not quite name, hoping no one asked too many questions about why we were up here in the first place. Zacchaeus sat in his tree and waited, in his tree, and then the crowd came around the bend, and with it the sound of a man walking through it, calm, unhurried, surrounded by 12 men and 100 pressing strangers, and yet somehow moving with the quality of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Jesus walked the road toward Jericho with the kind of pace that crowds parted around rather than slowed. He was used to them by now, the pressing, the reaching, the people calling out from the edges. He was not indifferent to them. He never was. But he moved with a settled quality, as if the noise existed in a different register than the one he was operating in. And then he came to the sycamore tree, and he stopped. The Gospel of Luke does not describe any pause before this moment, no searching of the branches, no lifting of his eyes the way you would to scan unfamiliar surroundings. He simply stopped, and he looked up, and he spoke. "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." 5 things happen in that sentence that deserve to be named slowly. First, he used his name, not you, in the tree, not hey, come down. He called him Zacchaeus. In a city where Zacchaeus was known by name, known by reputation, known by the size of the grudges people held against him, the use of his name by a stranger who had never walked these streets before was not a small thing. It was intimate. It was the act of someone who already knew him, not just who he was to the crowd, but who he was underneath that. Second, he told him to come down immediately, not gently, not as a suggestion. There was urgency here, a sense of movement. What was about to happen was not casual. It was not incidental. It was the point. Third, he said I must, not I would like to, not would you be willing to have me. I must. In the Gospel of Luke, that phrase carries a specific theological weight. It is the same language used when Jesus speaks about fulfilling what he was sent to do. Staying at Zacchaeus' house was not an afterthought. It was part of the mission. This moment was not accidental. It was destined. Fourth, he said your house. Of all the houses in Jericho, of all the people lining the road, of all the worthy citizens and devout synagogue goers and well-regarded community members who would have been overjoyed and honoured and would have told the story for the rest of their lives, he chose the house of the man no one would choose, the man in the tree, the man alone in his wealth, the man who was already being watched with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt by everyone in earshot. Fifth, he said today, not someday, not when things are different, when you are better, when you have made amends, when you have earned this. Today, right now, as you are, from exactly where you're sitting, up in a tree, dusty-sandaled, small and desperate. Today. Zacchaeus came down immediately. The text is clear on this point. There was no hesitation, no negotiation, no moment of wondering whether this was a good idea. He came down out of the tree and he welcomed Jesus joyfully. The word used in the original Greek carries the sense of receiving with gladness, with warmth, with open hands. It was not a polite reception. It was not the measured welcome of a man managing his reputation. It was joy. The kind of joy that surprises you when it arrives, the kind that you did not realize you had been saving space for. The crowd watched all of this happen, and the crowd had thoughts. The murmuring began almost immediately. Luke uses a word that suggests it spread through the crowd the way a low sound moves through a room. Not a shout, not a confrontation, but the unmistakable sound of people sharing a disapproval they expected to find confirmed in each other's faces. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. There are layers to that sentence worth spending time with. The crowd was not entirely wrong in its facts. Zacchaeus was, by any reasonable accounting, a sinner. He had spent years overcharging people who could not afford to be overcharged. He had grown rich on a system that ground his own neighbours into financial hardship. The crowd's assessment was not the product of ignorance or prejudice alone. It was rooted in actual, documented, lived experience. These were people who had been taxed by men under Zacchaeus' oversight. They had sat across tables from collectors who took more than was owed. They had watched their resources dwindle while men like Zacchaeus grew prosperous. Their discomfort was not simply social. It was economic and spiritual and deeply personal. But the crowd was wrong about what was happening. Not in their description of who Zacchaeus was, but in their assumption about what that meant for where Jesus should go. They had built, as most of us build, a mental map of who deserves what. Good people deserve good things. Righteous people deserve to be the ones sitting at the table with the teacher. Sinners, real sinners, with records and reputations, should wait at the edges until they have shown sufficient evidence of change. It is a deeply human framework. It is also, according to this story, precisely the framework Jesus consistently refused to operate within. He had done this before. He had eaten with tax collectors in Capernaum at the home of a man named Matthew, who would become one of his 12 closest companions. He had spoken publicly to a Samaritan woman at a well, a conversation that violated multiple layers of social and religious convention simultaneously. He had allowed a woman with a notorious past to wash his feet with her tears at a Pharisee's dinner party, and had defended her when his host assumed he must not know who she was. Again and again, in story after story, Jesus moved toward the people that the religious and social establishment had moved away from, not casually, deliberately, as if he was making a point. The crowd murmured, and Jesus kept walking towards Zacchaeus' house. The murmuring was not wrong exactly. It was just incomplete. It had seen the present without being able to see what the present was about to become. Sometimes the people watching cannot see what the person standing at the threshold of change is on the edge of becoming. Sometimes grace looks like a scandal from the outside, precisely because it is grace. If it only went to people who already deserved it, it would not be grace. It would just be a reward system, and reward systems do not save anyone. They only confirm what was already true. The crowd that day got to watch something that very few people ever get to watch in real time, a life turning on its axis. They just did not recognize it yet. We do not know what happened inside Zacchaeus' house. The Gospel of Luke does not give us the conversation, does not describe the meal, does not tell us what Jesus said to him across the table, or what Zacchaeus said in return. What we are given is only the outcome, and the outcome is extraordinary. Zacchaeus stood up. This physical detail matters. Standing in that cultural context was a posture of formality and declaration. He was not making a quiet, private decision. He was making a public statement, in his own home, in the presence of Jesus and whoever else had gathered there. "Look, Lord," he said, "here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Pause here, because this is the moment the story has been building toward, and it is easy to move past it without fully inhabiting what it represents. Half of his possessions. This was not a man writing a cheque he could afford. This was not a gesture of comfortable generosity from a place of surplus. Zacchaeus was committing to a restructuring of his entire financial life, half gone, to the poor, immediately, voluntarily, without being asked, and then the fourfold repayment. Under Jewish law, the standard restitution for theft was the original amount plus 1/5, approximately 120% of what was taken. Some categories of theft required double repayment. The fourfold standard Zacchaeus invoked was actually higher than the legal requirement. It was the penalty for the most serious category of theft under Mosaic law, the stealing of livestock. He was not calculating the minimum he owed. He was reaching for a number that communicated something beyond calculation. I understand what I have done. I am not minimizing it. I want to make it more than right. Here is what makes this moment theologically stunning. Jesus had not told him to do any of this. There had been no sermon on repentance, no list of conditions for continued fellowship, no lecture on what a changed man would look like. Jesus had simply come to his house. He had simply sat at his table. He had simply been present in the full and unhurried way that Jesus was always present with people who had never been fully seen before. And that presence, just that, had been enough to do something that years of wealth and power and social pressure and religious expectation had never managed to do. It cracked something open. It let something real through. Zacchaeus, who had spent his professional life taking from people, stood up in his own home and began giving back. Not because he had been told to, because something had changed in the deepest part of him, and this was simply what that change looked like when it reached the surface. True transformation always moves outward. It does not stay in the interior. When something real happens at the centre of a person, it cannot help but begin reorganising everything around it. The finances, the relationships, the patterns of behaviour that had seemed fixed and permanent, and simply the way things were. Zacchaeus standing up in that room was not the start of his transformation. It was the evidence of one that had already begun. Jesus responded to what Zacchaeus had said with a statement that is one of the most important sentences in the entire Gospel of Luke. Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Let us move through this carefully, because every word carries weight. Today salvation has come to this house, not someday, not eventually, after the paperwork of repentance has been fully processed and the required waiting period has elapsed. Today. The same word he had used when he called Zacchaeus down from the tree. The urgency was consistent. What God is doing, he is doing now. The grace being offered is not deferred. It is present. It is already here, already at work, already in motion by the time we recognize it. This man too is a son of Abraham. This phrase deserves particular attention. The crowd outside had murmured that Jesus had gone to be the guest of a sinner. They had, in their disapproval, implicitly placed Zacchaeus outside the community, outside the covenant, outside the belonging that defined what it meant to be a people with a God and a history and a future together. Jesus was not simply disagreeing with their moral assessment. He was reclaiming Zacchaeus' identity. He was saying, this man belongs. He is not outside. He is not other. He is a son of Abraham, which is to say, he is part of the family. The past does not remove him from the family. The murmuring of the crowd does not remove him from the family. His own failures do not remove him from the family. He belongs here. He always belonged here. And today, that belonging has been made visible again. There is something in that phrase, this man too, that carries particular power. The two acknowledges the presence of everyone else in the room, everyone else on the street, the long line of people who had always been considered part of the community. And it says, and him, and also him. The circle is larger than you thought. It always was. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This sentence is the hinge on which the entire story turns. It is a summary of mission. It explains not just why Jesus went to Zacchaeus' house, but why he came at all, why the roads travelled, why the meals eaten at suspicious tables, why the woman at the well, why the man lowered through the roof, why every story in the Gospel that features someone being found. The purpose was search and rescue, not judgment and classification, not reward and punishment based on accumulated merit. Search, active, initiative-taking, going where the lost are search, and then rescue, bringing back, restoring. Not because the lost person had earned it, but because the Son of Man had come specifically for them. Zacchaeus was lost, not figuratively, not in a vague spiritual sense, but in the specific practical way that a person becomes lost when the life they have built has taken them somewhere they never intended to go, and the path back is too unclear to navigate alone. He was lost inside a city where everyone knew his name, inside a profession where he held real power, inside a home full of the evidence of his wealth. He was thoroughly, completely lost. And Jesus had come to Jericho that day, among other reasons, because of this one specific man in this one specific tree. There is a detail in this story that is easy to pass over because Luke presents it so quietly, without fanfare, as if it is simply part of the geography of the moment. Jesus was passing through Jericho. That phrase, passing through, implies transit. It implies that Jericho was not the destination, that he was on his way somewhere else, that this road was a corridor between points rather than a point in itself. And yet, he stopped. He looked up at a specific tree. He called a specific name. He announced a specific intention. The theologians and scholars who have spent centuries studying this passage have noted that Jesus was, at this stage in the Gospel of Luke, on his final journey toward Jerusalem. He knew what waited there. He had told his disciples what was coming, not once but 3 times with increasing specificity. Each time they seemed to forget or refuse to understand. He was walking toward the end of everything, toward the arrest and the trial and the cross and the 3 days in the dark. And on that road, in the middle of that walk, he stopped for Zacchaeus. That is not a small thing to sit with. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost, and he was demonstrating that mission even as he walked toward the moment that would make the mission complete. He was living the purpose while moving toward its fullest expression. The stopping at the sycamore tree was not a detour from the mission. It was the mission, in miniature, enacted one more time before the final act, which means that Jericho was not simply on the way to Jerusalem. In some sense, Jericho was the point. Zacchaeus was the point. The small man in the tree was the point. And every person since who has read this story and recognized something of themselves in that small, wealthy, isolated, desperately reaching man, every one of them was, in some way the text does not make explicit but the heart understands, part of the point as well. The road passes through Jericho because someone is waiting in a tree in Jericho. The road passes through your life because someone is waiting in your particular version of that tree. The mission does not miss the people who are hard to reach. It specifically goes for them. It goes there first, or it finds them along the way, or it stops on a dusty road in the middle of everything and looks up into an unlikely set of branches and says a name out loud. The mission has very good eyes. It sees further than the crowd does. It stops for people the crowd keeps walking past. This is the heart of the story, if you will let it be. Not simply that Zacchaeus was found, but that the finding was intentional, not accidental, not a happy coincidence of geography and timing. The text says, "I must stay at your house today." Must, not might. Not if it works out. Must. There is a divine necessity embedded in that word, a sense that the meeting beneath the tree was written into the itinerary long before either of them arrived on that road. You were written into it too. That is the claim of the gospel. Not that good things happen to good people who try hard enough, but that the Son of Man came specifically, purposefully, urgently for the lost, and the lost category has never been as small as the crowd assumes, and has never excluded the people the crowd most wants to exclude from it. There is a conversation that has followed this story through the centuries, carried by scholars and ordinary readers alike, and it is worth having plainly tonight. It is the question of whether Zacchaeus' declaration of repentance came before or after his salvation, and what the answer means for how we understand the story. One reading suggests that Zacchaeus' declaration, "I will give half to the poor, I will repay fourfold," is the act of repentance that prompted Jesus to declare salvation. On this reading, Zacchaeus showed evidence of a changed heart, and Jesus confirmed what that evidence pointed to. Another reading suggests that Jesus declared salvation first, or at least that the salvation was already in motion the moment he called Zacchaeus by name, looked up at him with full knowledge and full acceptance, and said, "I must stay at your house today." On this reading, Zacchaeus' declaration is not the cause of salvation, but the effect of it. Grace came first. The transformation followed. The giving and the repaying were not the payment for admission. They were what happened to a man after admission had already been freely extended. The second reading is the one that most closely matches the narrative logic of everything Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke. Grace initiates. Grace moves first. The paralyzed man is forgiven before anyone has requested it. The prodigal son, in the famous parable told a few chapters earlier, is met on the road and embraced before he finishes his prepared speech. The lost sheep is found not because it found its way back, but because the shepherd went looking. In every case, grace takes the initiative. In every case, the human response, the gratitude, the changed behaviour, the declaration of intent, is the fruit of grace, not the price of it. This matters enormously for how we hear our own names, wherever we happen to be sitting tonight. It means the call does not wait for your improvement. It means the name is spoken before you have had time to clean yourself up, figure out what you will say, prepare your statement of intent, or calculate whether you are worthy enough to come down from the tree. The name is spoken while you are still up there. The house is requested while you're still deciding whether to be embarrassed by the whole situation. Today is spoken while you're still thinking about someday. Genuine repentance, as this story illustrates it, is not a performance of worthiness. It is the natural consequence of being genuinely met. When a person is truly encountered, not evaluated, not managed, not offered a transaction, but actually encountered, something moves in them that cannot be manufactured by obligation or religious requirement. Zacchaeus did not give away half his wealth because he had calculated the cost-benefit analysis of generosity. He gave it because something had happened to him at the table, in the presence of someone who had seen him fully and not flinched, and the giving was simply what his heart looked like when it was finally open. Real transformation produces real fruit, but the fruit does not produce the transformation. The roots go deeper, and the roots, in this story as in the whole arc of the gospel, are watered by grace that arrived before the fruit was visible, before anything was visible, when there was nothing to commend the man in the tree except the fact that he was there, that he had run ahead, that he had climbed, that he was still reaching for something even if he could not have named it. That reaching was enough. It is always enough. The reaching, however imperfect, however embarrassed, however high above the ground, and however uncertain about what it is reaching toward, the reaching is always enough to be met. The sycamore tree itself has become one of the most quietly beloved details in all of biblical narrative. It is the kind of specific, seemingly unnecessary detail that great storytellers include because they know that specificity is the doorway to truth. Luke could have simply said Zacchaeus climbed a tree. He said sycamore, and that precision has sent countless readers and scholars and pilgrims down the road to Jericho, literally and imaginatively, to look at the trees that line the old paths of that ancient city. The sycamore fig tree, known in the scientific world as Ficus sycamorus, was a common feature of the ancient Near Eastern landscape. It was valued for its shade, its fruit, and its wood, which was light and resistant to decay, and was used in everything from building construction to the making of coffins. The Egyptians prized it. The ancient Israelites knew it well. In the time of King David, a man named Baal-Hanan the Gederite was appointed to oversee the sycamore figs in the western foothills of Judea, a role important enough to be recorded in the books of Chronicles. These were not minor trees. They were features of the landscape, landmarks of everyday life. Their branches began low. This is the arborist detail that matters most for our story. Sycamore figs were not tall, austere trees that required serious climbing skill to ascend. They were accessible. Their lowest branches were within reach of ordinary adults. They were the kind of tree that children climbed after school, that shepherds rested beneath on warm afternoons, that travellers sat under when the road grew long. They were hospitable, in the way that good trees are hospitable, offering themselves as shade and shelter and foothold without requiring anything in return. That Zacchaeus chose this particular kind of tree to climb is, perhaps, its own kind of grace. He did not need to be an experienced climber. He did not need special equipment or unusual physical gifts. He needed only to be willing, to be desperate enough that the willingness was easy, and to show up at the right place on the right road at the right time. The tree did the rest. The tree was already there, already waiting, already the right height and the right width and the right species for a short man who needed a better view. There is a tradition among Christian pilgrims who visit Jericho even today of seeking out the sycamore trees that grow in and around the old city. A large and ancient sycamore fig tree in the centre of modern Jericho is, by local tradition, identified as the very tree Zacchaeus climbed. Whether or not that specific tree is genuinely the one from the story, and the scholars are appropriately cautious about such claims, something true happens in the people who stand beneath it, and look up into its branches and try to imagine a small, wealthy, lonely man sitting there, watching the road, not yet knowing that the road was already watching back. The tree is still there. In some form, in some expression, the tree is always still there, offering its low branches to anyone willing to climb, waiting on the edge of the road where the crowd is too thick to see through, ready to be the solution to the problem of not being able to see. The question the story asks quietly as you settle towards sleep is only this: are you willing to climb it? Are you willing to run ahead, to look a little foolish, to let go of whatever you're protecting long enough to reach for something you cannot quite name? The branches are low, the road is close, and someone is already looking toward the tree. One of the most striking things about this story, when you hold it next to the broader sweep of the gospel narratives, is the way it handles the question of community. The crowd in Jericho is not presented as evil. It is presented as human. These were ordinary people who had legitimate reasons for their feelings about Zacchaeus. They had lost money to his system. They had watched their families stretched thin by tax demands they could not meet. They had absorbed the indignity of being bled by one of their own people on behalf of a foreign empire. Their disapproval had texture and history. It was not simple prejudice. It was earned, at least in part. And yet the crowd's earned disapproval was also a kind of cage, not for Zacchaeus alone, but for themselves. The murmuring that spread through them when Jesus chose Zacchaeus' house was the sound of people whose categories were being disturbed. They had built a careful map of who belonged and who did not, who deserved mercy and who had forfeited it, who was welcome at the table and who should wait outside until further notice. That map gave them something: order, clarity, the comfort of knowing where the lines were and which side of each line they stood on. Jesus consistently disturbed those maps. Not arbitrarily, not to provoke, but because the maps were too small, they left people out who should not have been left out. They drew the borders of belonging too narrowly, and in doing so they created a world where certain people had no path back, where the combination of what you had done and what people remembered about it made redemption functionally impossible. You can repent all you want, those maps said, but we will still remember, and remembering, we will keep the borders where they are. Grace does not operate on those maps. That is what the crowd in Jericho was learning, and struggling to learn, and probably still processing days later when the story had moved on, and Jesus had continued toward Jerusalem. The map they had been given, the one that said sinners wait outside, was being redrawn in real time, in public, in a way they could not look away from. The redrawn map included Zacchaeus. This man too is a son of Abraham. The two was not incidental punctuation. It was the redrawn border. It was the expanded circle. It was the word that said, your map was missing someone and now he is on it. Now he is inside the line. Not because the line moved arbitrarily, but because the line had always been drawn in the wrong place, and what you are watching now is a correction. For the crowd, this correction was uncomfortable. For Zacchaeus, it was life-changing. For us, reading the story 2,000 years later from whatever corner of the world we're sitting in, it is an invitation to examine our own maps, to notice who is outside our lines and whether they should be, to consider whether the people we have categorized as beyond the reach of grace might, from a different vantage point, be exactly who grace is moving toward. The sleepy koala army comes from everywhere, from across the street and across the ocean, as I like to say, from countries and cultures and backgrounds that carry their own versions of this story, their own tax collectors, their own crowds, their own sycamore trees by their own dusty roads. And in every version of this story, in every language and every landscape, the same thing is true. The grace is wider than the crowd thinks. The circle is bigger than the map shows. The name is spoken before the person in the tree has earned the right to hear it. You do not need to earn the right to hear it. You never did. The name was already known. The house was already chosen. The today was already decided. All that remains in every version of this story is the coming down from the tree, the receiving joyfully, the standing up in the house and letting the transformation show, and then the walking back out into the world as someone who has been found, carrying something that the crowd cannot yet see but will eventually be unable to miss. The Gospel of Luke does not follow Zacchaeus after this story ends. We do not know what happened when he began giving away half his wealth. We do not know how the people of Jericho responded when he started the process of repayment, whether they believed it was genuine, whether they accepted the money with suspicion or with something more open, whether the relationships that had been severed by years of exploitation were ever fully repaired. We do not know whether Zacchaeus ever saw Jesus again, whether he was among the crowds in Jerusalem in the days that followed, whether he heard what happened at the end of Passover week. The story ends at the house, with the declaration, with the mission statement, and then it moves on. This is, in its own way, a kindness. The story trusts us to understand that transformation does not require a documented follow-up to be real. It trusts us to know that the hard, practical work of making things right, the 4 times repayment, the redistribution of wealth, the slow rebuilding of relationships that were broken over many years, that work was real and ongoing and difficult, and it does not need to be narrated for us in order to matter. We are given the moment of beginning. The continuation is left to the imagination, and perhaps to the lives of everyone who has since read this story and recognised their own name being called from somewhere below the branches. What the story does leave behind, fixed permanently in the text and in the memory of everyone who has encountered it, is a set of images that carry their own kind of weight. The small man in the big crowd, the undignified run through the streets, the climbing of the tree, the name spoken from below, the coming down, the joyful receiving, the standing up in the house, the declaration that was not asked for, the salvation announced, the belonging restored. These images have outlasted the Roman Empire that built the road Zacchaeus ran along. They have outlasted the political structure that created the tax collection system he worked within. They have outlasted every attempt to domesticate them into comfortable religion, to sand them down into something that does not disturb the careful maps of who deserves what. They keep their power because they keep pointing at something that does not change. The hunger that money cannot fill, the loneliness that power cannot cure, the reaching that embarrasses itself and keeps reaching anyway, and the voice that answers before the reaching is done. That voice has been answering for 2,000 years. It answers tonight. It answers in the quiet of your room, in the dark behind your eyes, in the particular weight of whatever you have been carrying into this night. It answers not because you have cleaned yourself up sufficiently to deserve an answer, but because the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost, and the lost have never needed to prove their lostness to qualify. The qualification is simply the condition. The reaching is simply the evidence of the hunger, and the hunger is simply the sign of the thing that was made to be filled. Let it be filled tonight. Not by effort, not by deserving, not by finally arriving at the version of yourself that you imagine would be worthy of being seen. Let it be filled by the simpler, older, more stubborn truth. You are already seen. You have always been seen. The name was known before you climbed the tree, before you ran ahead, before you knew there was a road to run along. The name was known, and tonight it is spoken quietly, in a register just below the noise of everything that usually drowns it out, in the stillness that comes when you finally let the day fall away and lie still in the dark and just listen. Come down, rest, be here. You are home. Zacchaeus could not see Jesus. That was his problem at the beginning. The crowd was too large, he was too short, and no one in the press of bodies around him had any interest in making space for the man they despised. He could not see, so he ran ahead. He climbed a tree. He put himself in a position that cost him whatever remained of his dignity, because seeing, just seeing, seemed worth more than whatever he was protecting. But here is what the story actually shows us. The moment Jesus looked up at Zacchaeus in that tree, the problem was not Zacchaeus' inability to see Jesus. The problem, if we can call it that, was Zacchaeus' certainty that he was invisible, that his wealth had made him visible to the tax tables but invisible to anything that mattered, that his power had given him influence but removed him from belonging, that the people who cleared the room when he entered did so because he was not worth looking at with kindness. He was not truly trying to see Jesus. He was trying to be seen, and he was, immediately, completely by name, before he had done a single thing to deserve it. There is something almost unbearable about being seen truly for the first time after years of invisibility. Not performed visibility, not the kind that comes with power or money or reputation, but the real kind. The kind that says, I see you underneath all of this. I see what you have been carrying. I see the thing beneath the thing, the person beneath the tax collector, the man beneath the wealth and the loneliness and the walls. I see you. Come down. Zacchaeus came down from that tree a different man than the one who had climbed it, not because anything external had changed yet. He had not yet given away the half of his possessions. He had not yet calculated the repayments. He had not yet begun the long, practical work of making things right with the people he had wronged. All of that was still ahead. He came down different because he had been seen. And being seen, truly kindly without condition, is one of the most transformative things that can happen to a human being. The psychologists and the theologians agree on this, even if they use different languages to say it. We are changed by being witnessed. We are changed by being named. We are changed by the experience of encountering someone who is not afraid of what they see when they look at us, who does not flinch, who does not revise their expression into something careful and managed, who simply looks and says, "Yes, I see you. Come down. I must stay at your house today." That is what happened beneath the sycamore tree in Jericho. A man who thought he was trying to see experienced the far more disorienting and far more healing thing of being seen. And his whole life began to rearrange itself around that moment. Stories that have been told for 2,000 years tend to have survived for a reason. They contain something that keeps finding new readers, new listeners, new people in new centuries who lean forward in recognition and think, "That is me." Or, "I know that feeling." Or, "I did not know I needed to hear that until just now." The story of Zacchaeus has survived for 2,000 years, and it is worth asking why. Part of the answer is its honesty about human complexity. Zacchaeus is not a simple villain redeemed by a simple moment of moral clarity. He's a man who built a life around getting what he wanted, and discovered that what he wanted had left him empty. He's a man whose reach for belonging expressed itself, paradoxically, as the sort of behaviour that guaranteed its absence. He took from people because the system rewarded taking, and because the reward filled something, even if it never filled the right thing. He was simultaneously more powerful and more isolated than almost anyone in Jericho. That combination is not unfamiliar to modern readers. It is, in various forms, extremely familiar. Part of the answer is the image of the tree. There is something so raw and so universal about a grown person climbing a tree to see something they desperately need to see, without caring how it looks, without calculating the social cost, simply moving toward the thing that is pulling at them. Most of us have had our version of that tree, the thing we did that was slightly embarrassing in its need, the reaching past decorum for something that seemed worth more than the decorum. Zacchaeus in the sycamore resonates because it is recognisable. We have been up there too. Part of the answer is the reversal at the centre. The man who could not see was already seen. The one who thought he was anonymous to everything that mattered had been noticed before he noticed anything. The seeker was found before the finding was complete. There is something in that reversal that speaks to a hope that most of us carry somewhere beneath the surface. The hope that we're not as invisible as we sometimes feel, that the reaching matters even when it feels insufficient, that something is looking back. And part of the answer is the declaration at the end. Today salvation has come to this house. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This is a story that explicitly claims to be about a mission, and the mission is toward people like Zacchaeus. Not despite them, not after they have cleaned themselves up, toward them. The direction of movement in the story is consistently Godward toward the human, not the human striving upward toward an approval that keeps moving just out of reach. Grace initiates. Grace calls by name. Grace says, "Today, here, you. Come down. No one is beyond this reach." That is the claim of the story. Not as a sentimental aspiration, but as a theological conviction rooted in the specifics of what happened on one afternoon, on one road in one Roman city 2,000 years ago. Zacchaeus was beyond what the crowd thought was reachable. He was not beyond what actually reached for him. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to read this story and place yourself firmly on the side of the crowd. To see yourself as the one murmuring with reasonable cause, the one who knows what the tax collector did and has every right to remember it. It would be easier, and closer to the truth, to consider whether you have ever been in the tree. Not literally, of course, but there is a version of that tree in most lives. It is the moment you found yourself doing something slightly embarrassing in its need, reaching past what was comfortable, past what was expected, past the version of yourself that had learned to stay safely behind the walls. It is the moment you wanted something enough to let people see you wanting it. It is the moment the wanting was larger than the protecting. And perhaps there is also a version of that voice. Perhaps there have been moments in your life, quiet ones, easy to explain away, easy to file under coincidence or wishful thinking, when something found you before you finished looking, when you felt briefly and inexplicably known. when a door opened that you had not quite gotten around to knocking on, when the thing you were reaching for seemed to reach back, just slightly, just enough. The story does not require you to have a specific theology to let it do something to you. It requires only that you be willing to sit with the possibility that you have been Zacchaeus, that you have been small in a crowd, invisible in the middle of plenty, certain that the walls you built were permanent features of your landscape, and that you have in some moment run ahead anyway, climbed higher anyway, looked even when looking felt foolish. What the story offers, at its quietest and most honest level, is this: the looking is not wasted. The reaching is not embarrassing from every angle. There is a perspective from which you're climbing towards something real, however imperfectly, however publicly, however far above the ground you're willing to go. There is a perspective from which that climbing is seen and met and answered with a name. Your name, today. Come down. The streets of Jericho are quiet now. The crowd has dispersed. The sound of voices and shuffling sandals has faded into the warm evening air. The sycamore tree still stands by the road, its branches low and broad, its shadow falling across the dust in long shapes that shift as the light changes. Somewhere in a house in the city, a man who was rich is becoming generous. A man who took is beginning to give back. A man who was known by everyone and truly known by no one has been called by name, welcomed into a belonging he had stopped believing was possible. The math of his life is being rewritten, not because he earned a revision, but because something visited him that did not wait for earning. He had climbed a tree to catch a glimpse of something he could not name, and before he could truly see, he was already seen, completely, kindly, by name, with urgency and warmth and the specific weight of a word like today. As you settle towards sleep tonight, let that image rest with you, the man in the tree, the voice looking up, the coming down, the joy of being received as you are from exactly where you are, without conditions, without a waiting period, without being required to be different first. Let your body soften into the surface beneath you. Let your breath find its own pace, slow even, unhurried as a late afternoon in a city that has just witnessed something impossible become ordinary. Let the sounds around you fall into the background, like the murmur of a crowd moving away down a road, growing quieter with each passing moment until there is only the stillness. In that stillness, you are not invisible. You're not too far gone. You're not too anything. You're exactly as findable as Zacchaeus was, sitting in his branches, not knowing that the one he was looking for had already seen him coming. You are already seen. You have always been seen. Let that be enough to carry you gently, easily, safely into sleep.